Thunder Rally by Nathanael Reed. Prologue. Alex Gray squared his shoulders and glared defiantly up at the man towering over him. His father's words cut through him like a million sharp knives. "You listening to me, boy?" Alex held his father's eyes. "I'm listening." "Not likely. That's your problem. You never listen." Alex could feel his shoulders sag before the tall, dark-haired man. His mother's hand reached out and pulled meekly at her husband's arm. "Now, John, Alex does try his best." "Does he now?" John Gray glanced dismissively at his wife. "Does he really? I'll tell you when this boy tries his best. Never. He's never put a real effort into anything in his entire life. Look at him." He waved his meaty hand a few inches in front of Alex's face. "You think he'd be good at something, wouldn't you? School, football, even tiddlywinks would be better than nothing." Alex squared his shoulders. "I am good at some things." "He does his best, John," Alex's mother agreed. "His best." John Gray grunted loudly. "I'll tell you what doing your best is all about," he said. "It's getting up at 5:30 every morning to milk a herd of dairy cows, then taking the bus 35 miles to school. It's about playing varsity baseball and getting straight A's. That's what success is all about." Something within Alex seemed to give up and die. He dropped his gaze and took a long, deep breath. How many times had he heard this before? Reminders of his father's early mornings on the farm, about playing varsity baseball and his years in the Navy SEALs. He knew he should be doing better in school, trying harder and all that, but what was the point? Nothing he could do would satisfy his father anyway. Nothing. "I'll tell you something, boy," his father continued. "This little trip up north to visit your friend, Joel Flynn, might be just what the doctor ordered. There's still real men up there in the northern wilderness. Trappers, hunters. Maybe some of it will rub off on you. It'll be a lot different than what you see every day around here, hanging out in the mall and playing your precious video games." "It would be nice if he was coming with us to Hawaii for Christmas," his mother suggested. "No more coddling," his father stated emphatically. Alex flinched. "I'll never do enough to make you happy," he said, his voice cracking. "I'll never make varsity or get straight A's. None of my teachers even like me." "Of course they don't. You're too interested in slacking off and getting by with minimal effort." "That's enough, John," his wife said firmly, steering her husband toward the door. "Alex is going to be gone for 2 weeks, and we don't want him to be thinking about this when he's away up north." Father and son eyed each other in the glare of the Christmas tree lights. Finally, his father gave his hand a dismissive wave. "What am I wasting my breath for? You're never going to change. You'll be a lazy slacker till the day you die." Alex felt a small shudder pass through him as he watched his father head out the door to the car. 2 weeks in northern Ontario. As much as he hated the thought of the cold and snow, spending the holidays with Joel Flynn and his family might be just what the doctor ordered. After all, Joel had been his best friend since kindergarten, at least until he'd moved north this past summer. His spirits rose slightly. Surely whatever awaited him in Canada's frozen wilderness couldn't be as bad as living in the same house as his father. A faint smile creased Alex's face as he followed his parents out into the night air. He took a deep breath of the cool December night and looked up into the darkened sky. A few snowflakes drifted down and melted against his face. "Merry Christmas," he whispered. Chapter 1. Blizzard. The frigid north wind howled across the darkening lake, sweeping the falling snow into the onset of an unforgiving blizzard. Icy cold pellets bit into the faces of the 2 boys, searing their lungs and making vision beyond a few feet impossible. Lost. Alex Gray tucked his face further into his parka and scowled at his friend, Joel Flynn. This was not how a perfect winter's day of ice fishing was supposed to end. "We're going in circles," he shouted, catching Joel by the arm and jerking him to a stop. They stood for a moment, faces hunched into the warm shelter of their parkas, their breath coming in short, painful gasps. "I guess we should have stayed in the fishing shack until morning," Joel replied. "I guess so," Alex agreed sarcastically. Joel squirmed at his friend's harsh words. "It got dark so fast, and then this storm blew up. I've never seen anything like it." He knocked the thick snow from the webbing of his snowshoes. "We've got to be near shore. We've been walking for almost a half hour." He drew several deep breaths, trying to quell the anger that had been coursing through him. Anger at Joel, who'd gotten him into this mess. His eyes swept the blackness and swirling snow for signs of the tree line. Why, oh why, had he agreed to come north for the Christmas holidays? He should be back home in the city, warm and snug, waiting out the last few days until Christmas. He grimaced as he imagined his father relaxing on the warm beaches of Hawaii while he was freezing to death here. Perfect. He watched Joel shelter his eyes with a heavy mitten, searching for the shoreline. "So what do we do?" Alex asked, this time trying to keep the sarcasm from his voice. "We've got to get off this lake. Once we reach shore, I'm sure I can get my bearings, but out here it's impossible. You're right, we have been walking in circles." Alex noticed that their snowshoe tracks were already filling and knew that within minutes their trail would be completely obliterated. He drew the collar of his parka up past the fringes of dark hair that protruded beneath his hat and then squinted hard into the blizzard, desperate for even the faintest of landmarks. There was nothing. "Let's keep moving." Joel tucked his face down into his parka and plunged once more into the maelstrom. Alex ploughed after his friend, but with every step the cold crept through his heavy clothing and clutched at him like the hand of a huge invisible monster. His face felt like a block of ice, and his fingers and toes were numb. He folded his hands into the arms of his coat as a feeling of exhaustion crept over him. "What's that?" Joel stopped so abruptly that Alex almost bumped into him. He was pointing straight ahead of them through the storm. Alex followed the direction of the other boy's hand. "I thought I saw a flicker of light," Joel said, slowly swinging his snowshoes back into motion. Alex gritted his teeth and struggled on through the rising drifts, pushing each snowshoe one laborious step at a time, while keeping his eyes locked in the direction that Joel had indicated. Then he saw it, a tiny flicker far in the distance. "Maybe it's a fishing hut," Alex shouted above the wind. "I doubt it. It's too high. It must be set up on the shore. It could be an old trapper's shack. There are plenty of them scattered around Kenogami." The tree line gradually emerged from the night, and then the shape of a small cabin. From the lone window glimmered a tiny speck of yellow. "Where are we?" Alex asked. Joel shook his head. "No idea. That cabin doesn't look the least bit familiar. We're probably in some kind of bay. It is a big lake." They trudged the last few steps up the shoreline to a rickety-looking shack. Joel removed a heavy leather mitt and rapped on the plank door. Even above the blizzard's howl, they could hear a sharp scraping sound inside the building. "Well, at least somebody's home," Joel said. He was lifting his hand to knock again when the door creaked open. Framed in the light of the doorway was the strangest-looking person Alex had ever seen. Even though the man was standing on the raised door stoop, he was barely taller than Alex, and his hair seemed to erupt straight up from the top of his head in a great tangled thicket. A pair of wire-rimmed glasses was perched precariously on his thin nose, magnifying his eyes and giving him the appearance of a wild-haired owl. Still, their reluctant host stood motionless, staring wordlessly out at his two visitors, his lips set in a thin, grim line. Alex felt his mouth go dry. "We were ice fishing and got lost in the storm," he finally stammered. "We saw the light from your cabin, and we were hoping you could help us." Even then the man did not speak, but simply moved reluctantly back inside his cabin and waited for his two guests to enter. Alex and Joel quickly stepped out of their snowshoes, propped them against the cabin wall, and followed their host inside. The heat of the wood stove wafted over Alex in a glorious rush. The cabin's interior had a definite cozy feel, although a hissing kerosene lantern revealed only the barest of furnishings. A crude wooden table, 4 mismatched chairs, a narrow cot covered with several grey wool blankets, a large wood stove and wood box, and against the far wall, a long coffin-shaped storage box. Joel dropped into the nearest chair, oblivious of the snow he had just tracked across the floor. He let out a long, contented sigh. Man, this place was a sight for sore eyes. I guess we shouldn't have waited until dark before we left our ice hut. The man grunted. "The radio's been warning about a major winter storm for 3 days," he said gruffly. "I guess we missed that," Joel said, his ever-present grin unfazed. "What do you expect me to do for you? I ain't got no phone." Alex could feel his nerves begin to fray at the man's indifference. "Look," he said, "can you at least tell us how to get home? We were due more than an hour ago, and Joel's folks will be having a canary by now." "Don't mind my friend here," Joel said with a grin. "He has some anger management issues. I think that's why his family sent him up north for the holidays." Alex ignored the wink. "Where are we anyway?" Joel pulled off his hat, allowing his blonde hair to tumble down around his collar. "Collier's Bay," the man answered. "Northeast end of the lake." "Never heard of it," Joel admitted. "Not surprised," the man answered. "Kenogami is a big lake." "No kidding," Alex said. The man was about to turn away when Joel suddenly leaned forward, extending his hand. "I'm Joel Flynn, and this is my friend, Alex Gray. I live down at the south end of the lake." "The name's Johnson." Ignoring Joel's hand, he returned to the stove and stoked the fire. Alex's toes began to tingle as the heat found its way through his thick boots. "You've got a real nice spot here, Mr. Johnson." Joel stretched out his legs, surveying his surroundings. Alex grimaced as he once again witnessed Joel's cool, unflappable personality in action. Nobody could roll with the punches with a grin on his face like Joel. Even when his dad retired from the police force and packed the family up north to this god-forsaken place. Always cool, always confident. He often wondered how he and Joel had become such good friends. He also knew that despite their differences, he'd never had as good a friend as Joel. He knew as well that his average, sensible appearance couldn't compete for a minute with Joel's curly blonde hair, blue eyes, and good looks. "I'd like to get a place like this one day," Joel was saying. "It would be a great getaway for ice fishing or snowmobiling." Johnson scowled. "I live here year-round. I don't have no fancy home to go to when I get tired of roughing it like some city folk." Alex looked into the man's dark, haggard face, and for an instant their eyes met. A chill rippled through him, and he quickly shifted his gaze away from the strange little man and over to the long box stretching the full length of the wall to his left. "We were lucky to make it to shore." "It's easy to go around in circles in a blizzard," Johnson agreed. "Lots of people never find their way to shore, especially when you're lost on a lake the size of Kenogami." "Are you a trapper?" Joel asked. Johnson moved over to the door, removed a heavy parka from a hook and pulled it on. "Soon as you're thawed out, I'll take you up to the main road. You won't have no trouble finding your way home from there." "That would be great," Joel said. "My folks will be mighty grateful." Alex rose stiffly to his feet, every muscle in his body screaming in protest. Never before had he been so tired. To make matters worse, his toes, cheeks and ears were beginning to thaw out, burning and tingling as the circulation returned to the frost-bitten regions of his body. "All set?" Johnson swung open the door, and a blast of Arctic wind howled into the room, sweeping a thin carpet of snow across the plank floor. With a groan, Alex pulled on his hat and mitts and stepped back into the blizzard, his breath catching as the cold enveloped him. "You can come back tomorrow and get your snowshoes," Johnson suggested. "There's an old road all the way to your place." Halfway across the clearing, Alex turned and glanced back at Johnson's cabin. As he did, the storm seemed to catch its breath. Almost hidden in the tall spruce trees behind the shack was a large barn-like structure. His brow furrowed. What on earth would Johnson be doing with such a building? His cabin didn't even have electricity. Alex shivered as the cold crept back into the gaps of his clothing. He turned and hurried after Johnson. Something about their strange-looking guide filled Alex with uneasiness. Why, for instance, hadn't he answered Joel when asked if he was a trapper? Johnson led them through the forest until he came to a fork in the narrow, snow-covered trail. "This here's the old Ferguson Highway," he said. "You ought to be all right now. Just follow this road for a mile or so, and it should take you by your place." Before either boy could reply, Johnson abruptly turned and started back toward home. Alex shook his head. "That's one odd duck." "We'd better get cracking," Joel said. "My folks will probably have a search party out looking for us by now." "No doubt," Alex said grimly. "Well, let's go face the music." Phys-Ed class. It was one of those dreams where you know you're asleep, but it's so real and unsettling, you wake up in a cold sweat, your heart pounding wildly. He was back in Phys-Ed class doing sit-ups, but it seemed that only he and Joel were there, just the two of them doing sit-ups for Mr. Williams, their Phys-Ed teacher. Alex was lying on a padded gym mat, completely drenched with sweat as he struggled through an agonizing series of warm-up exercises. Good old Mr. Williams always enjoyed seeing his students suffer through these dreadful warm-ups at the start of every class. This time, however, the sit-ups just wouldn't end. They went on and on and on. And the very worst part of the horribly weird dream was when Mr. Williams suddenly morphed into his own father. There he was, standing over him and yelling. "Why can't you do sit-ups like your friend over there?" he screamed, jerking a thumb toward Joel. "He looks like he could go all day." Across from him, Joel banged out another half-dozen sit-ups, not a drop of sweat soiling his spotless white t-shirt. "You can do it, Alex," Joel said encouragingly. "It really isn't so hard. Your dad is just making you do them for your own good." Alex's father leaned to within a couple of inches of his face. "That's right, boy. You gotta suck up the pain and bite the bullet. You never know. This might be the one thing you turn out to be good at. Make me proud of you, boy." Chapter 2. The Sled. By the time Alex and Joel finally stumbled downstairs the next morning, Mary Flynn was already bustling about the dining room. "I thought you boys were going to sleep all day," she said, setting a large plate of toast down on the table. "Joel, go into the kitchen and get the eggs." Alex glanced out the window and breathed a sigh of relief. The cloudless blue sky peering down at him was at least a small consolation to last night's nightmarish adventure. "Hard to believe it was so awful last night," Mary Flynn said. "You boys were lucky to have found your way off that lake in such a storm. We were worried to death." "Where's Dad?" Joel asked, returning with the eggs. "He went into town first thing this morning. He should be back any minute." Alex sat down across from Joel. "I don't suppose you boys will be going out ice fishing again soon." "Ice fishing's boring," Alex replied. "You just sit for hours in a cramped little shack, staring at a hole in the ice waiting for some poor fish to decide whether or not it's hungry." Joel nodded understandingly. "We should have left for home earlier," he admitted, "but I wanted Alex to catch at least one fish for all his troubles." "Well, I'll bet you didn't find things too boring when you got lost in that blizzard." Mary Flynn shook her head disapprovingly. "I shudder to think what your mother will say, Alex, when she finds out what happened to you on the second day you were here." "We're sorry to have worried you, Mom," Joel apologized. Alex was surprised when the slightly dishevelled-looking woman planted a kiss on her son's cheek. She and Joel's dad were both a lot older than his own parents, a fact which probably went a long way in explaining why Joel always seemed to have them wrapped around his little finger. His two older sisters were long since married and living in the States with their own families. Mary Flynn stood by the dining-room window, looking out into the bright morning sunshine. "What was the name of that man who helped you last night?" "Johnson," Joel said. "He lives in a cabin down on Collier's Bay at the north end of the lake." "Really?" his mother said. "Your father was just telling me that the new snowmobile trail goes right through there now." "Snowmobile trail?" Alex asked, anxious to change the subject. Joel looked over at his friend. He said with a grin. Someone's spidey senses are tingling. Alex grunted. "I'm no snowmobiler. You're the northern boy. I was only able to piddle around on an old rental outside the city where I got my snowmobile license." "You wouldn't believe the trails around here, Alex," Joel said around a mouthful of eggs. "They're all professionally groomed and are as wide and smooth as most highways. People come from all over North America to ride on them." As if on cue, an ear-shattering roar erupted just outside their front door. Joel and Alex both jumped to their feet and raced to the large window overlooking Lake Kenogami. "Who on earth was that?" Alex asked, his eyes slowly adjusting to the glare. 100 feet from the house, a shiny red snowmobile was accelerating swiftly into the distance, a swirl of white powder trailing out behind it. "Lance Higginson!" Joel said with a scowl as the machine and rider disappeared into the woods. "He must have gone right through our yard," Mary Flynn said in astonishment. "I know the snowmobile trail is near here, but he shouldn't be taking shortcuts through our property." "Lance Higginson's the biggest show-off in northern Canada," Joel said. "His rich daddy even retooled his sled so it would go faster." "His sled?" Alex asked. "His snowmobile," Joel explained. "He's going to get killed driving that fast," Mary Flynn said as they returned to their breakfast. "Snowmobiles are getting too powerful for their own good." "That reminds me," Joel said, his eyes brightening. "They're having this awesome snowmobile race here just after Christmas. It's called the Thunder Rally. We'll have to take it in, especially if Lance Higginson loses." Alex scowled. "Great. Another opportunity to freeze to death and be bored out of my skull at the same time." "I'm saving up my money to buy a snowmobile," Joel continued, ignoring his friend's sarcasm. "I should have enough by next winter. In the meantime, Clarence lets me practice on his machine." "Who's Clarence?" "He's an old prospector friend of ours," Mary Flynn answered. "He and his wife Agnes live across the lake." "He's got a real old snowmobile," Joel said. "Probably like the one you got your license on. Clarence lets me take it out any time I want, but it's almost 10 years old and pretty slow." The dull mutter of a truck engine drifted into the dining room. "Sounds like your dad's back," Alex said. Mary Flynn bustled over to the window. "He said he wouldn't be long." Both boys looked up as the front door opened and a tall, grey-haired man stamped his way inside. "Howdy, Dad," Joel said. Jack Flynn had the tanned complexion of a man who lived in the outdoors. A thick moustache covered his upper lip, and from beneath his brushy eyebrows, 2 dark, smiling eyes gazed back at him. "Come here," he said, waving Joel and Alex over to the door. "I've got something to show you." With a curious glance at his father, Joel crossed the room and stepped outside. Alex followed close behind. Standing in the driveway was the Flynn's half-ton truck. The tailgate was down, and behind the vehicle was parked a gleaming black snowmobile with red racing stripes. "Whoa, man!" Joel shouted. "Where did you get the awesome sled?" Jack Flynn grinned down at him. "Merry Christmas, son. A day or two early. What do you think?" Joel stared dumbfounded at his dad. "It looks brand new." "Of course it's brand new," his dad said with a laugh. "Get dressed and try this baby out." Joel and Alex scrambled back into the house and threw on their outdoor clothes. "I wondered why you had that silly grin on your face this morning," Joel said, giving his mother a quick hug. The snowmobile was a high-performance Polaris with a tapered front end and a plush leather seat that could hold 2 riders comfortably. Joel slid behind the steering column. "It's a beaut." His dad handed them 2 black and red helmets and the ignition key. "It's gassed up and ready to go, so you might as well take her for a spin." Alex slipped on his helmet, then jumped onto the seat behind his friend. "Don't forget to put into practice all the things you learned at the snowmobile safety course," Jack Flynn reminded his son. "You boys be careful," Mary Flynn added nervously. Joel turned the ignition and the big motor roared to life. "Hold on tight," he shouted over his shoulder. Alex barely had time to grab the 2 leather straps beside him before the sudden acceleration hurled him back in his seat. With a deafening roar, the snowmobile shot down the shoreline and out onto the trail stretching across the broad, frozen surface of Lake Kenegami. A groomer had already packed down the snow from the previous night's blizzard, so the trail was hard and almost as wide as a 2-lane highway. Alex had snowmobiled on trails outside the city back home, but never had he travelled at the speed that Joel quickly reached. It was breathtaking. The snow-covered surface of the lake flashed beneath them in a frightening blur, a cloud of powder spraying out in their wake. 100 yards from shore, the snowmobile hit a ridge and soared through the air. Alex's heart leapt into his mouth as they hung suspended for what seemed like an eternity before finally crashing back down onto the trail. "We'll go by Clarence's place," Joel shouted over his shoulder. "Show off a bit." He swung the sled sharply to the left and around a point of land jutting out into the lake. In the cusp of a small bay, an A-framed cottage sat nestled in a grove of pine trees just back from the shoreline. A thin spiral of smoke drifted from a stone chimney at the far end of the building. Joel cut the motor as they sailed up the shoreline and slid to a stop in front of the house. "Man," Joel said, removing his helmet, "we sure could have used this machine in that blizzard last night." "I'll say." Alex's heart was still beating a wild tattoo in his chest. "You can go around in circles a lot quicker on a sled like this than on a pair of snowshoes." A beat-up yellow snowmobile was parked by the front door of the A-frame. The word "Ski-Doo" was stenciled in big black letters down the side of the engine cover. Alex couldn't help thinking how old and well-used the snowmobile looked compared to Joel's shiny black Polaris. An old man appeared in the doorway. He was wiry and slightly stooped, with hair cut almost to the level of his pink scalp. In his left hand he held a half-finished piece of toast. "Joel!" he shouted, tossing the toast in the direction of a nearby bird feeder. Stepping down from the porch, he circled the Polaris appraisingly. "Christmas present," Joel said, patting the leather seat affectionately. The old man looked up at Alex, his grey eyes twinkling. "This must be your friend from the city you were telling us about," he said, giving Alex's hand a firm shake. Joel nodded. "Alex and I have been best friends since kindergarten, long before I moved up here. I wondered what my little animal friends were whispering about lately," he said. "Must have been talking about you. But you never can tell about those critters. They're full of stories, half of them they make up." "Now you be careful, Clarence," Joel said. "You'll have Alex believing your tall tales." He ran a hand along the gleaming, dark surface of the snowmobile. I guess I won't have to borrow the old ski-doo anymore." He looked up at the old man. "How about coming with me for a quick spin around the lake?" Clarence laughed. "Some other time? My breakfast hasn't even had a chance to settle." He continued to eye the snowmobile admiringly. "This sure is a fine machine," he said. "I'll bet you might even be able to race it if you had a mind to." "Oh, I do," Joel said with a grin. "I certainly do." Chapter 3. Agnes. Clarence ushered Alex and Joel through the living room and into a small bedroom. An elderly woman lay in the middle of a large bed, propped up by several pillows. A small book lay open on her lap. "We've got visitors, Agnes," Clarence announced. The face of the frail woman lit up with a smile. "I know," she said. "I heard them arrive." "It's good to see you, Agnes," Joel said, sitting down on the edge of the bed. "How are you feeling?" "Not bad for an old lady," Agnes said, patting his hand. "This must be the friend that was coming for a visit." "It sure is," Joel beamed. "I'd like you to meet my best friend from back in the city, Alex Gray." Agnes held out her hand. "It's nice to meet you, Alex. I hope you enjoy your stay in the Northland." Alex felt strangely flustered as he carefully shook the older woman's hand. Agnes's fingers were swollen and twisted from arthritis, yet there was something almost regal about her. Alex cleared his throat. "It's nice to meet you, too." "What are you reading now, Agnes?" Joel asked. Agnes glanced down at the book on her lap. "Oh, it's a book of poetry by Marion Donaldson, an old friend of mine. I was just reading one called The Choice. Listen. My candle flickered in the gloom. As, huddled in my dismal room, I gloated in its warmth and light, a golden circle in the night. A gentle knock came at my door. A sweeter voice than heard before said, 'May I share my light with you? My life is full, my love is true.' A harsh voice whispered, 'Keep him out. He means to snuff your candle out and take your warmth and light away. Or wait at least some other day.' My choice I made, my door flung wide. I welcomed Christ himself inside. All shadows fled before his face. His love now warms my dwelling place." Alex sighed, a little more loudly than he'd intended, then stirred uncomfortably as all eyes in the little room turned toward him. "My grandmother used to read me things like that, but she passed away last summer." Memories of the last time he had visited her in the hospital returned. He hadn't known that would be the last time he would see her, and not saying a proper goodbye had haunted him ever since. He swallowed hard. "You remind me of her," he said awkwardly. "Really?" Agnes said, smiling. "What was she like?" Alex cleared his throat. The nurses all called her Sunshine Nana, I guess 'cause she was always smiling. "It's wonderful to have a special grandparent." Agnes looked over at her husband. "Clarence and I don't have any children of our own, so we don't have any grandchildren either, but Joel helps to make up for that." She reached over and patted Joel's hand. "I had a special grandmother too. She lived with us until I was 12 years old." Somehow, Alex found it hard to imagine someone as old as Agnes having a grandmother. "Is that when she died?" Joel asked. "That's right. She went to sleep one night and didn't wake up the next morning. For years I felt terrible about not saying goodbye to her, but we treated each other special when she was alive, and that's what counts." Alex's brow furrowed at the old woman's words. It was almost as if she had read his mind. "That's how it was with my grandmother, too." "You must have been the apple of her eye, Alex," Agnes said. Alex shrugged. "I was her only grandchild." "I know that I'd be very proud to have a grandson like you." Agnes looked at him for a long moment, her smile lighting up the little room. A A strange sense of peace passed over Alex as he watched Clarence lean forward and kiss his wife on the cheek. "Will you be joining us for a cup of tea, my dear?" She smiled and shook her head. "Not right now. I'm pretty stiff and sore this morning, but leave the door wide open so I can listen." "We'll bring our tea back in here," Clarence said. "Come on, boys." He led the way out to the kitchen. "You fellas take a seat while I put on the kettle." A topographic map was spread out on the kitchen table. "What are you up to now, Clarence?" Joel asked. "Back to prospecting for gold?" Clarence chuckled softly. "Not with all this snow on the ground, but I do like to make a study of different things." He returned to the table and sat down beside Joel. "The tea will be ready in a jiff." Joel leaned over the map, his eyes brightening. "Say, Clarence, do you know what route they're using for the Thunder Rally this year?" "Sure. I helped cut that new section last summer." With a red felt pen, he traced a winding trail across the map. "It begins on the outskirts of the town of Kirkland Lake, 8 or 9 miles east of here. Then it winds toward Lake Kenogami, cuts down its length, then zigzags back through the forest toward town." 20 miles of rolling thunder," Joel said with a laugh. "Oh, it's an exciting course," Clarence continued. "There are a few places, like out there on the lake, where drivers can really pour on the coal, but in most other places it's quite winding." "How will the race work?" Alex asked. "Will all the drivers start at once?" Clarence laughed. "No. The snowmobiles will leave in groups of 4 at 1-minute intervals. That way drivers will be racing against the clock as well as against each other. The fastest time over the course wins the race. Admission is only a donation to the local food bank, and the top prize is just a plaque. The organisers want to keep it to local races so it'll be fun and friendly." "That explains what Lance Higginson was doing this morning then," Joel said. "The trail must go right by our place." "It sure does," Clarence agreed. "It passes within 100 yards or so." Alex turned to his friend. "You'd better get serious about practicing if you expect to win." "That's for sure," Clarence agreed. "The more familiar you are with the course and its little idiosyncrasies, the faster your time will be." "Well, it's not like I haven't had any practice," Joel said, grinning at Clarence. "I've been out enough on your old Ski-Doo." "And if you can drive a pernickety old machine like that," Clarence said, "and drive her as well as you do, I'd say you'd have an excellent chance." Joel's face turned a shade red at the unexpected compliment. Alex was a little surprised that the ever-confident Joel was so pleased with the praise. "What about this Lance Higginson?" Alex asked. "Didn't you say that his engine had been retooled?" Clarence pushed back from the table with a loud snort. "Having a souped-up engine is only half the battle, fellas. Knowing how to drive well is the ticket." "I wish there was a way of checking Lance's time," Joel said. "Then we'd know if we had a chance of beating him. If someone else wins, that's fine, but seeing Lance win will be hard to take." "Knowing his time would set the bar all right," Clarence agreed, pouring each of them a mug of tea. "Why don't you fellas leave that little problem with me? I'll give it some thought." Joel turned his attention to the map. "I've already been over a good part of this trail on the Ski-Doo." "No doubt," Clarence agreed. "But your new Polaris puts you in another league. I'd have to upgrade every single part in my old Ski-Doo to keep up with you now." The boys laughed. "Any suggestions?" Joel asked. Clarence bent over the map and studied the route carefully. The trail is fairly wide, but in places it's as curvy as a nimble-footed garter snake. He looked up at Joel. "Even though each group of racers will be starting at intervals, it's important you use every opportunity to pass as many racers as you can. Most won't have sleds anywhere near as powerful as yours." He tapped his finger on the large blue area representing Lake Kenogami. "Here is where you're really going to have a chance to air it out. A mile of straight-out full throttle." Alex could feel a thrill go through him at the thought of tearing across the lake at breakneck speed behind the controls of Joel's snowmobile. "Now just remember," Clarence continued, "you fall off one of those sleds doing 70 miles an hour and you'll hurt yourself real bad. The snow won't protect you much, especially if you hit a tree or a stump." He snapped his fingers. "You could end up getting killed or badly hurt just like that." Joel grinned reassuringly at the older man. "I'll be careful." "You keep this map," Clarence said, folding it up and handing it to Joel. "Study it. Get to know each bend, each twist and turn, each hill and straight stretch until you see the course in your dreams." He stood up from the table. "Now let's take our tea into the bedroom and keep Agnes company for a while." As they entered the bedroom, Agnes waved her hand and pointed to the large window at the far end of the room where several chickadees flitted about a brightly coloured feeder. "Aren't they pretty?" Clarence ushered Alex and Joel over to a couple of chairs by the foot of the bed. "We thought we'd take our tea in here with you, my dear. Would you like a cup?" Agnes shook her head. "Perhaps later." "You have quite the view," Alex said. "It's really amazing that those little chickadees could survive a blizzard like we had last night." "Clarence installed that picture window 2 summers ago," Agnes said, patting her husband's hand. "You'd be surprised at the wildlife that passes by our little home." They sat quietly for a moment, sipping their tea. "Do you know a man named Johnson who lives at the north end of the lake?" Joel finally asked. Clarence set down his mug, his brow wrinkling. "Johnson. Funny-looking guy with this wild head of hair," Alex said. "Kinda looks like a mad scientist." "I think I know who you mean," Clarence said. "He lives in a shack on Collier's Bay, as I recall. But he's not the kind of guy who likes to stop and chat." "That's right," Alex said. "We stumbled upon him last night during the blizzard. Kind of gave me a bit of the heebie-jeebies." "Yeah," Joel agreed. "He has this big outbuilding behind his place, and inside his cabin he's got a long wooden box that's locked up tighter than a miser's safe." "Who is he anyway?" Alex asked. Clarence shrugged. "I met him when I was staking claims up there a couple of years ago. He's probably just some oddball poacher. There's still a few of them around." "What would he be poaching?" Alex asked. "Mink, beaver, marten, moose, you name it. Poachers don't worry about licenses, or how they do it, or how many hides they take. He might be using the outbuilding to cure the hides and the big box inside the cabin to store them in." Joel nodded his head. "That's it then. I asked him if he was a trapper, and he didn't answer. Probably hit a nerve." Alex's brow furrowed suddenly. "Wait a minute," he said, sitting back in his chair. "When we were leaving Johnson's place last night, there was something that struck me, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it, until now." Joel nodded. "What was it?" "It was an aerial," Alex said, looking over at Clarence. "I saw a radio aerial on the top of a long pole just behind the cabin. I don't think he has any electricity, but he could have a battery-powered shortwave radio. Back in the city, my scoutmaster was a real shortwave radio nut. He had an aerial as high as Johnson's." "Shortwave radio," Joel echoed. "Who on earth would have one of those nowadays, what with computers and email and everything?" "Maybe that's why he has one," Clarence suggested. "If there aren't many shortwave radios around, there'd be no prying ears listening in. I remember reading about Russian spies in the 1950s who used shortwave radios to contact the motherland." "But what possible secrets could a guy living out in the bush have that the Russians would be interested in?" Alex asked. "Unless it's how many mosquitoes inhabit Maguire's swamp," Clarence suggested with a chuckle. "Or how many pike are being pulled out of Kenogami on any given day in the month of June." Joel scratched his head thoughtfully. "Probably just a strange man with an even stranger hobby." "But he really might be up to something shady," Alex said. "Maybe it's time someone sent Comrade Johnson back to Mother Russia." Chapter 4. Lance Higginson. Clarence stood at the door of his cottage watching as Alex and Joel strapped on their helmets. "Wait," he called, pulling a set of keys from his pocket. "Alex, why don't you take my old Ski-Doo? You can use it while you're up here. I've only driven it a couple of times this winter. You are licensed, aren't you?" "You bet," Alex said, his eyes lighting up. "I got my snowmobile license earlier this winter back home. Thanks a million, Clarence. This should be a lot of fun." "Now you be careful," Clarence warned. "I've kept this old sled in good repair, so it's still pretty fast." Alex dropped into the seat of the battered yellow Ski-Doo and started the engine. It immediately roared to life, the sound of the raw power of the motor surprising him. He looked over at Clarence and gave him the thumbs up. "What do you say we get some practice for the big race?" Joel shouted, then led the way back out onto the lake. Alex followed the sleek black Polaris, slowly getting the feel of Clarence's Ski-Doo and gaining confidence. A rush of exhilaration swept through him as they accelerated out across Lake Kenogami. The power of Clarence's snowmobile was a pleasant surprise, even though he suspected that Joel was not opening his machine full out. A few short minutes later, they were sweeping past the fishing hut they'd occupied the previous day and turning toward Collier's Bay. Alex grinned to himself as they slowed to cross the small clearing by Johnson's cabin. "The old hermit won't be happy about having all these snowmobiles roaring by his place," he muttered. He and Joel drew their sleds to a stop 100 feet or so from the cabin, and for a moment sat on their idling snowmobiles, gazing at the peaceful wilderness and the tall, snow-covered stands of pine and spruce trees. Alex pointed toward a large building nestled on the far side of the clearing. "What do you think he uses that big building for, anyway?" Joel craned his head for a better view. "Well, it would be just about the right size for hanging furs to dry. Looks like a big garage." "Not likely," Joel disagreed. "Johnson doesn't seem to be the kind of guy who would own a car." "Maybe it's a barn then," Alex said with a grin. "A horse and buggy might be more his style." Just then, the door to the cabin opened and Johnson stepped out into the morning sunshine. "I guess we ought to go over and collect our snowshoes," Joel suggested, giving Johnson a friendly wave. Johnson remained standing in the doorway, squinting his brushy eyebrows, making no effort to acknowledge the boys in any way. Alex gave his head a shake. "Weirdo," he muttered. Johnson turned and disappeared back into his shack. "I'll get the snowshoes," Joel said, getting down from his sled. He walked over to the shack and quickly scooped up the 2 pairs of snowshoes and returned to the sleds, lashing them to the back of the Ski-Doo. "According to the map," Joel said, "this trail will take us to the finish line. Why don't we check it out?" Alex gave the other boy a quick nod, gunning his motor at the same time. In a swirl of snow, they roared off down the trail past Johnson's cabin and into the forest. From Lake Kenogami, the trail wound in great, graceful sweeps through the tall timber. So thick were the branches overhanging the trail that in many places the winter sun was barely able to filter through, casting the trail in shades and shadows. A long series of moguls made it critical for the drivers to literally stay on their toes. Alex found himself in awe of the rugged terrain as they penetrated deeper and deeper into the northern wilderness. As he watched Joel handle the lightning-fast Polaris, it also became evident that his friend was a very skillful driver. It seemed to Alex that Joel possessed a built-in radar system, alerting him to each twist and turn in the winding trail. About 3 miles from Lake Kenogami, they crossed the Blanche River and down into a steep ravine. Alex cut his throttle, then as they started into a sweeping curve at the bottom of the hill, gradually eased back down on the accelerator. A moment later, just as they were crossing an ice-covered stream, Joel hit his brake so hard that Alex came within inches of colliding with the back of his friend's machine. A few feet ahead of them, idling dead center in the middle of the trail, sat a bright red snowmobile, its driver nonchalantly smoking a cigarette. Slowly he turned and looked back over his shoulder, his pale blue eyes gazing insolently in their direction. Alex could see Joel's face flush angrily. "Lance Higginson," he said in a low voice. He pulled the helmet off and stepped down onto the trail. "Dangerous place to stop," he said in a low voice. Lance exhaled a final cloud of tobacco smoke, then flicked the butt into the nearby trees. "New machine?" He eyed the Polaris appraisingly. "And who's the fairy tale with you?" Joel met the other boy's stare, pausing for a moment before answering. "This is my friend, Alex. He's visiting for the holidays." "From Disneyland?" Alex felt a slow burn begin to fill him. He climbed from his machine and walked up to the other boy. "You're blocking the trail." Lance eased himself from the snowmobile and stretched lazily. "You girls must be going to a pajama party. You seem to be in an awfully big hurry." "Move your sled," Alex said, taking a step closer. Lance finished stretching and turned. "Now you two pretties wouldn't be practicing for next week's Thunder Rally, would you?" "You'll find out," Joel said with a shrug. "Sooner or later." "Probably later," Lance said with a sneer, "like a half-hour after the race. That's how far behind me you'll be." Alex glanced down at Lance's red Arctic cat. It was a beauty with stencils of various companies coving it from one end to the other. He bent down for a closer look when Lance suddenly reached out, grabbed him by the front of his coat and gave him a heave. "Keep your hands off my sled." Alex staggered several steps before catching his balance. With an angry cry, he sprang at the other boy, his right fist cocked behind his ear. "Wait!" Joel stepped between them, grabbing Alex's coat. Alex was so close to Lance that he could smell the stale tobacco on his breath. He gave Lance a furious shove, his eyes blazing. "Keep your hands to yourself." Lance turned and dropped back onto his snowmobile. "I'll be seeing you chapsticks at the finish line next week." He turned, his eyes meeting Alex's. "But try not to be too long. I'm a busy man." Alex could feel the veins in the side of his head throbbing as Lance restarted his sled and disappeared off down the trail. "I've never met anyone I've wanted so badly to beat up," he said quietly. "Strong words, Alex." Joel managed a small grin. "Talk like that can get a guy into serious trouble." "I can't help it. Guys like him really get my goat. They think they're God's gift to man, and we're only there to be stepped on." "I know what you mean, but don't let old Lance get under your skin. He's just a rich, spoiled brat. The best way to get to him is by beating him in the Thunder Rally." Alex took several long, deep breaths to calm himself. "He sure has one mean-looking machine. Do you think you can take him?" "He's got a souped-up engine. Compliments of his rich daddy," Joel said with a shrug. "But Lance isn't famous for being a terribly disciplined driver. I think I have an advantage in that department." "Then you'll have to practice," Alex said, thinking once again of Lance's leering face. "Practice, practice, and more practice." His voice rose. "You'll have to be on your sled so often you'll start getting bow-legged." Joel grinned and nodded. "I'll beat him all right," he said. "You can count on it." Into the fire. Alex sat staring into the fireplace, watching the flames flicker and dance brightly in the stone hearth. Why, oh why, had he gotten so upset with that Lance guy this afternoon? Why hadn't he just grinned and shrugged, like Joel always did? He groaned. And why did he always compare himself with Joel? Always comparing, always coming up short, and never good enough to satisfy the old man. He continued staring into the fire, mesmerized by the orange and yellow flames licking at the pieces of firewood. He couldn't remember ever feeling so completely despondent and helpless, but the feeling had been building for some time. 10 more days till he returned home. But what would he do then? The gloomy feeling seemed to deepen. Nothing he did would ever make his dad think he was worthwhile. He knew that now. Some things were set in stone. And maybe it wasn't so important anyway. If only he could convince himself of that. Somehow he had to get over all of this, put his dad behind him and get on with his life. He looked up to see Joel approaching the fireplace, a snowmobile manual tucked under his arm. Back to reality. Perhaps reality was the first step in dealing with his increasingly complicated life. Certainly his dad would probably never change, and so nothing he did would ever affect that. But maybe he could change in a way that made him feel more at peace with himself and the way things were at home. Chapter 5. The Side Hill Gouger. Christmas tradition? Joel echoed. That's right. His mother bustled back into the kitchen. This is our first Christmas in the north, so we're going to do it upright. This is the time of year to spend with family and friends, so we thought it would be nice for us to spend Christmas Eve with Clarence and Agnes Sprague at their place. They don't have any family. It'll be fun, guys, Jack Flynn assured them. Clarence is a real musician, so there'll be carol singing, storytelling, and lots to eat. Joel rolled his eyes. Alex and I were going to go for a ride and see what the trails are like at night. Oh, I think you boys have been out on those snowmobiles enough the last couple of days, his mother said, stirring a pot of something on the stove. What are you making, Mrs. Flynn? Alex asked, edging closer to the spicy aroma. Apple cider. A broad smile lit up her face. Now this really is an old family tradition. She carefully poured the steaming golden liquid from the pot into a large thermos on the kitchen counter. That just about does it, she announced. You boys put your coats on and get out to the car. This evening we're driving around the lake to the Spragues. No shortcuts on your noisy snow machines. Alex groaned inwardly at the thought of a wasted evening. The only redeeming thing about the holidays so far had been the time spent on Clarence's old ski-doo. Christmas Eve at Clarence and Agnes's should be fun, Joel said as he pulled on his boots. They're real nice. Alex managed a small grin. I guess it would be pretty lonely for them if they had to be by themselves this evening. The 15-minute ride around Lake Kenogami reminded Alex of drives he and his family had taken in the country when he was small, back before his father had realized his only son wasn't all he'd hoped for. Millions of stars blanketed a cloudless sky, and a huge yellow moon hovered just over the eastern horizon. Great night for a snowmobile ride, Joel said with a sigh. I hope it's like this again tomorrow. Christmas or not, we've got to get you back on the trail. It looks like we were expected, Jack Flynn said, pulling the car to a stop in front of the brightly lit cottage. Clarence met them at the door, a broad smile lighting up his craggy face. Merry Christmas, everyone! Come on in! Agnes lay on a sofa in the middle of the living room, propped up by several large pillows. Her face seemed to glow in the light of the fireplace. At the far end of the room stood a large Christmas tree, and piled beneath its branches lay a number of brightly wrapped presents. This is lovely, Mary Flynn said. She crossed over to Agnes and gave her a warm hug. Thank you for inviting us. We're so glad you came, Agnes replied, squeezing Mary's plump hand. Alex took a seat in one of the armchairs across from the fireplace. Do you play the guitar, Clarence? He asked, noting an instrument case by the sofa. Banjo. Clarence pulled a long, thin, guitar-like instrument from the case. Far out, Clarence, Joel said with a laugh. I never knew you played the banjo. Christmas carols and a banjo, Jack Flynn said with a chuckle. This will be a first for me. Clarence dragged a straight-backed wooden chair up next to his wife and gave the banjo strings a quick plunking. What'll it be, folks? Christmas carols, of course, Mary Flynn said, giving Clarence a playful poke. "Do you need to ask?" The old man dove quickly into a bluegrass rendition of Jingle Bells, with everyone scrambling to keep up. Winter Wonderland, Silent Night, and a myriad of favourites swiftly followed, interspersed with cider, shortbread cookies, and some mouth-watering strawberry-filled scones that Clarence had prepared from an ancient recipe. Alex had to admit a grudging respect for the quality of singing that emanated from the little group. He was especially surprised at the strength and beauty of Agnes's voice. Finally, Clarence leaned his banjo against the sofa, tilted back in his chair and flexed his fingers. "That was a real workout. My fingertips are almost bleeding from the strain of it." He took a sip of the cider. "It was sure good of you folks to come over. We don't mind a quiet Christmas day, but it's nice to be with friends on Christmas Eve." "Christmas has always been the most special time of the year for us," Agnes said, smiling. "When you remember that it was on this day that the Saviour was born, what could be more special than that?" Alex found himself nodding in agreement. "That's often forgotten, isn't it?" "It's great to be here," Jack Flynn said. "Isn't it, boys?" Alex and Joel both echoed his sentiments. Clarence turned to his wife, a sly smile creeping across his face. "You know, a friendly get-together like this puts me to mind of family gatherings we had many years ago, and some of the stories that got passed down from generation to generation." Agnes shot her husband a dark look. "Now, Clarence," she cautioned. Clarence grinned. "You know, the woods around Kenogami have certainly spawned a rich tradition of oddball characters and ornery critters. Fact is, we've got a whole passel of grief-causing little monkeys in the hills just back of here." He leaned forward, arms resting on his knees, his expression taking a faraway look. "It's a mighty peculiar thing," he continued, chuckling softly. "I haven't given those little critters a thought for quite a spell. But of course, the side-hill gouger hibernates during the winter time." "The side-hill gouger?" Jack Flynn echoed. "Never heard of such an animal." "Well, you might not have, of course," Clarence said, turning to his guest. "You're from the city, and they're a right mysterious little varmint, keeping what you might call a low profile. Another thing, too, is the fact that they're nocturnal, which would explain why most folk never see them. They only come out at night, and they're fast, as quick as a greased lightning bolt. Of course, with their legs built the way they are, they'd have to be fast." "How's that?" Alex asked, intrigued. "Are they like rabbits?" The old man gave a good-natured snort. "No, although there are some definite similarities to the rabbit, but I'd say he's more like a groundhog, at least from a distance. You see, the side-hill gouger gets his name from the fact that he lives on the sides of steep hills where he gouges out his dens. In fact, it's on account of their peculiar abode that these critters are so unusual looking. Now picture this, if you will. On the one side of his body, the side-hill gouger has one long set of legs and a short pair on the opposite side. That way he can move about on the sides of steep hills." Joel's mouth dropped open. "Get out of here!" The old man nodded his head emphatically. "Let me finish. Let me finish." He swung his gaze in Alex's direction. "I can tell you another thing I've been told. There's left-handed side-hill gougers and right-handed side-hill gougers. They probably developed that way so they don't all run the same way on the hills where they live." Clarence picked up his mug of apple cider and took a long drink while the small circle of people stared at him. Alex grinned suspiciously at the old man. "Side-hill gougers?" Clarence set down his mug and gave his head an emphatic nod. "Oh, Clarence," Agnes said, sounding somewhat proud of her husband's yarn. "No more stories." Mary Flynn got to her feet and retrieved a brightly wrapped Christmas present from a shopping bag by the door. "Agnes, this is for you and Clarence." Slowly and with utmost care, the older woman unwrapped the colourful gift. "This was so thoughtful of you," she said, holding up a lovely green and white Afghan blanket. "You must have made this yourself, Mary." "I did," Joel's mother admitted, appearing pleased with her own handiwork. "I thought it would look nice on your couch." "It's beautiful." Agnes pressed the blanket against her face, her eyes filling with tears. "It must have taken you hours to knit." Clarence got stiffly to his feet and crossed over to the Christmas tree. "We also chose something practical for you two fellas," he said, picking out a box-shaped present and returning to the fireside. "Open her up, Joel. It's for you and Alex." Joel quickly tore into the bright red and green paper. "I told you boys I would come up with a way of timing Lance Higginson," Clarence said. "Well, this is it." Joel reached into the box and pulled out a stopwatch and 2 sets of headphones with attaching mics. "What is it?" Alex asked. "Looks like a walkie-talkie," Joel suggested. "It is," Clarence said. "Now you fellas can stay in contact with each other when you're out on the trail." "This is perfect, Clarence," Joel said. "Thanks." He leaned over and gave Agnes a hug. "It should come in handy when we're out on the trail, all right," Alex said. "It sure will," Jack Flynn agreed. "How's that?" his wife asked. "Well, for one thing," Jack Flynn began, "the boys won't have to shout to be heard when they're out riding. They can just talk to one another." Mary Flynn nodded understandingly. "You're going to need every little edge you can get when it comes to winning the race next week," Clarence said. "We'll talk later about how you can use the headphones to time our friend Lance." "We'll be able to keep the lines of communication open now," Joel said. "What a neat gift." He tried one on and noted that a small microphone extended from the headset down to within a couple of inches of his mouth. "One step closer," he said. "One step closer to what?" his mother asked. "One step closer to beating Lance Higginson," Alex answered. Chapter 6. Dry Run. The trail through the forest wound crisp and cold in the morning sunlight. Alex eased the throttle, negotiated a sharp bend, then quickly maxed the accelerator in a futile attempt to gain ground on Joel, who still managed to maintain a fairly generous lead despite Alex's best efforts. Christmas morning had been quiet. Joel had already received his main present, the snowmobile, and Alex had opened most of his presents back in the city before he left. By mid-morning, both boys were back on the trail. It had taken Alex a while to get used to the peculiarities of Clarence's snowmobile. Old and battered, the Ski-Doo was still quite powerful, although nothing compared to Joel's. The throttle on the right handlebar reminded Alex of the brake on his bike back home, but when he squeezed this lever down, the sled jumped forward like it was stung by a wasp. "Steady," Joel said. "You'll get the hang of it." The trail at the northern end of the lake reminded Alex of a tightly coiled maze, twisting and turning through stands of pine and spruce, making him think that the designers of the course must have been paid by the number of bends. Alex reached up and turned on his microphone. "We'll need more practice on this section. It's really tricky." Joel's voice crackled back to him through the headphones as they emerged onto a long, straight stretch. "How does my driving look from where you are?" "I think you're swinging too wide on the curves, Joel. You're losing time." "Okay, the finish line is just over this little rise. Let's catch some air." Side by side, the two machines soared over the last mogul and sailed through the air for the length of 2 parked cars. In another heartbeat, they were flashing between the 2 red metal poles, which indicated the finish line. "Lance must still be at home opening his presents," Joel said when they came to a stop. "I'll get on over to the starting line," Alex suggested. "For the past couple of days, Lance has arrived there at 11 o'clock sharp." He glanced down at his watch. I'll take the shortcut through the bush." Joel nodded. "Let's just hope our black-hearted friend doesn't take the day off, it being Christmas and everything." "I doubt it," Alex said. "He's probably afraid of losing whatever edge he thinks he has on you." "Remember to stay well out of sight," Joel reminded him. "And let me know on the walkie-talkie the second he starts. I'll get the stopwatch running." Alex eased the snowmobile onto the narrow trail which skirted the town. Once again he felt a thrill rush through him as he swept through the trees, leaning with each turn, accelerating a little more with each bend, his confidence growing. It was the perfect winter day. The snow from the recent storm still clung to the branches of the spruce and pine trees that lined the trail. Alex found his mind wandering far from the rugged beauty that surrounded him, back to his friends in the city. What would they say when he told them about his adventures? A sudden movement in a nearby clump of trees jerked Alex back to the present. He hit the brake, the snowmobile sliding to an abrupt stop. Nestled in a grove of poplars only a few feet from the trail stood a huge bull moose. The animal, seemingly oblivious to Alex's presence, munched calmly on some twigs. It was magnificent, gigantic. Its rack of antlers seemed as wide as the living room couch back home. Ever so slowly, the enormous animal turned its head toward Alex, studying him thoughtfully, its massive jaws working. For one long moment, Alex's eyes locked with those of the moose. Then it abruptly turned and plunged off through the deep snow and disappeared into the forest. Alex glanced down at his wristwatch. "I'd better get going," he muttered to himself. "I don't want to miss Lance's grand entrance." The Thunder Rally's starting line was on the northwest edge of the town, a stone's throw from the ruins of a long-abandoned gold mine. 2 green-painted poles had been erected on either side of the trail, and across the top hung a large banner with the words, "Thunder Rally," stenciled in huge gold and black letters. Alex eased his sled in behind a bushy cedar tree on the edge of the clearing and turned off the ignition. He loosened his helmet and sagged back into his seat, hoping Lance hadn't already left. High above him in the branches of the cedar, a whiskey jack chattered noisily, turning its head from side to side as it looked down at the intruder. Alex grinned at the little show-off, watching it flit from branch to branch, tilting its head expectantly, looking for a handout. Only the occasional roar of a passing snow machine disturbed the stillness of the winter morning. Ever so slowly, the sub-zero weather crept through Alex's thick clothing. Perhaps Lance was not going to show up for his daily practice run after all. Suddenly, the roar of an approaching snowmobile brought Alex back to attention. Lance Higginson. Alex adjusted the microphone. "Get that stopwatch ready. The pigeon has entered the nest." He watched Lance roll up to the starting line, rev his engine several times, then, with an ear-splitting racket, roared off down the trail. "Now," Alex called into the microphone, "start the watch." "Got it," Joel answered. Alex turned the ignition and eased out from behind the cedar. His heart raced, fueled by an overwhelming urge to put his driving skills to the test. He wanted to see how he, Alex Gray, measured up against Lance and his souped-up Arctic cat. He flipped on the mic. "Joel, keep the timer on until I get there. I'm going to see how fast this old clunker can go." The starting gate flashed by in a whirl of snow, and an instant later he was accelerating along the broad, groomed trail which rolled through majestic stands of spruce and pine. The first major bend was a long, sweeping curve skirting a large beaver pond. Alex eased up on the throttle, spotting Lance's powerful Arctic cat as it disappeared into the timber ahead of him. He grimaced. It was hard to believe how fast that sled was. For the next several miles, the trail alternated between exhilarating straight stretches and winding S-shaped bends. He knew it was on these sections that Joel would have to spend most of his practice time. Several minutes later, he shot out onto the surface of Lake Kenogami, almost 8 miles from the starting line. Alex glanced down at the broken speedometer as he started down the length of the lake. He wished he knew how fast he was going. 40, 45, 50 miles per hour. Without a doubt, this was the most exciting feeling he'd ever had. When he swung the Ski-Doo into Collier's Bay, only a thin column of chimney smoke betrayed any evidence of life at Johnson's cabin. What a mysterious man, Alex thought as he swept across the clearing. Why was Johnson so secretive about everything, never saying much or answering questions? And what on earth was he doing with such a big building behind his cabin? And who would use a shortwave radio nowadays? The trail beyond Johnson's shack was especially challenging. Alex felt a rising sense of pride in his ability to pilot the machine at high speeds and negotiate the sharpest of hairpin turns. Despite not seeing anything of Lance for the remainder of the trip, he relished the challenges presented by the various twists and turns and the endless series of moguls. Finally, he rounded the last bend in the course and slid to a halt at the finish line. There was no sign of Lance, but Joel was sitting astride his machine, a sour look on his face. "Where on earth were you?" Joel asked. "I tried to reach you on the walkie-talkie. Why didn't you answer?" Alex looked sheepishly at his friend. "I must have turned it off," he admitted. "You couldn't resist following Lance around the course, could you?" Alex shrugged. "What was his time?" 28 minutes, 41 seconds. Alex whistled. "What was mine?" Joel looked disgustedly down at the stopwatch. 30 minutes, 19 seconds. Alex's expression fell. 2 whole minutes! We'll never beat him! Joel remounted his machine and turned the ignition. "You may never beat him on that old clunker, but I sure plan on doing better than 30 minutes. You wait here." He handed Alex the watch. "I'll go over to the start line and let you know when to begin timing. Keep the walkie-talkie on. I'll beat your time, that's for sure." Alex grimaced as his friend disappeared through the trees with a roar and a cloud of snow. He sagged into the seat of Clarence's Ski-Doo and clicked on the walkie-talkie. "No doubt your time will be better," he muttered to himself. "After all, if you can't beat Alex Gray at something, what good are you?" Morning ride. The cold, morning air whipped in under the face protector of Alex's helmet and nipped savagely at his cheeks and the tips of his ears. It wasn't often Alex got to take the Ski-Doo out for a ride by himself, and he relished the feeling. At the top of a small hill, he rolled to a stop, the Ski-Doo idling noisily beneath him. At the foot of the hill, the vast reaches of Lake Kenogami stretched far into the distance. He breathed in a long lungful of winter air and thought back over the last few days. What a relief it was to get away from his folks for a while. Last night his mom had called to see how he was doing, and he was a bit surprised at how good it felt to hear her voice again. Maybe a couple of weeks apart would help his dad to appreciate him more. His thoughts turned to the Ski-Doo idling impatiently beneath him, and he felt a real sense of pride. What he wouldn't give to have his dad see him go tearing across Lake Kenogami on Joel's sled. Now that surely would be something that would make his dad sit up and take notice. With a strange sense of sadness, he finally settled back in the seat, revved the motor a couple of times, then roared out over the surface of the lake, leaving another pipe dream in a thick cloud of snow. Chapter 7. Sabotage. The table in Clarence's living room was cluttered with topographic maps, plates, and coffee mugs. Joel pushed himself back from the table and shook his head, a worried look on his face. "I don't trust Lance Higginson as far as I can throw him," he said, looking over at Alex and Clarence. "Is there any way he could cheat, like taking a shortcut or something?" Clarence grinned. "Oh, I wouldn't put it past Lance to bend the rules. I've known that boy since he was knee-high to a side-hill Gouger. But it's going to be almost impossible for someone to cheat in the Thunder Rally. Race marshals will be scattered all along the route, especially at spots where a corner might be cut or a shortcut taken. Alex looked over to the large rocking chair where Agnes sat, wrapped in the afghan that Joel's mother had given her for Christmas. "Good to see you're feeling better, Agnes." She smiled warmly. "It's so nice of you boys to stop by again this evening. Did you have a good Christmas?" "We spent most of the day out on the sleds," Joel admitted, getting up from the table and going over to the older lady. "I still haven't given up on taking you for a ride, you know." "You just never know," Agnes said with her ever-present smile. "If this old arthritis of mine would let up for a day or two, I'd love to go out on your new snowmobile. I am blessed having such thoughtful friends as you and Alex, and your wonderful parents too. The Lord is good." Alex found himself surprised at the mellowing influence that Agnes seemed to have on him. Whenever she was around, it seemed that everything was going to be all right, and the thing he liked best about her was the fact that she genuinely seemed to like him, just as he was. He glanced down at the bent and swollen fingers protruding from beneath the afghan. "Well," Joel said, "I think we've just about picked your husband's brain clean." He put his arm around Agnes and gave her a gentle hug. "The Thunder Rally is only 4 days away." "Have you timed yourself on the course with your new sled?" Clarence asked. Joel shrugged. "My times aren't bad. The walkie-talkies came in handy yesterday, by the way. We were able to clock Lance's run. I'm still about a half-minute slower." "That's good, isn't it?" Agnes asked. "Not good enough," Clarence said. 30 seconds is an eternity in a race like this one. "Joel's speed on the winding parts of the course is really improving," Alex said. "We've checked Lance's tracks and can see that he slows down too much for the sharp bends and takes them too wide. He's putting too much trust in the power of his snowmobile." "Good observation," Clarence said. "And he only practices once a day," Joel added with a grin. "It's on the straight stretches that he gains his time then," Clarence said. "That's right," Joel agreed. "His sled is quite a bit faster than mine." "Well, keep practicing. That's all I can suggest," Clarence said. "You've got to find ways of gaining more time on the turns and hope you don't lose too much on the straight stretches." "We'd better get going," Joel said, reaching for his coat. "We still have time for one more run before we call it a night." Clarence put a hand on the shoulder of each of the boys as he walked them to the door. "Now you fellas don't take any foolish chances. Even in a big race like this one, it's not worth getting seriously hurt or killed." "Yes," Agnes agreed. "Please do be careful, boys. Those machines can be very dangerous. And just remember that winning isn't everything. Life offers many kinds of challenges other than racing." "Thanks again for letting me use your snowmobile, Clarence," Alex said as pulled on his coat. "It's made the holidays a lot more fun." Clarence nodded. "Just be careful." It was a perfect evening, crisp and cold with only a hint of a breeze. Alex strapped on his helmet and wiped the visor with his mitt. "That Agnes is really something, isn't she?" he said. "She's in constant pain from her arthritis and she can't even leave the house anymore, yet she says that the Lord is good." "And she never gives up on trying to convert me," Joel added with a laugh. Alex's eyes narrowed. "Convert you to what?" "Into becoming a Christian. Maybe it's not such a bad idea, but there's lots of time for stuff like that when a person's older." Alex stared at his friend for a second. "What does she think we are, atheists?" Joel laughed. "Nah, but she believes that just because you live in a Christian country doesn't make you a Christian. With Agnes, it's personal, between yourself and Jesus Christ." "Isn't he dead?" "Not according to Agnes. That's why she doesn't get all worked up about the rotten things that have happened to her, like being crippled up. She believes everything that happens to you is God's will and meant to teach you something." Alex shook his head. I've never met anyone who thought like that, especially somebody so sick." "She is amazing, all right," Joel agreed, pulling on his helmet. "Now let's give these sleds a workout. I'm going to push my machine as hard as I can, especially on the winding sections. That's where the race will be won or lost. I'll let you catch up to me on the straight stretches." In a swirl of snow and a deafening roar, the two snowmobiles thundered out from the shoreline and across Lake Kenogami, their powerful headlights illuminating the trail far into the darkness of night. Once again, Alex found the experience intoxicating. The wind whipped under the plastic visor and reached through his thick clothing, but all he felt was the thrill of the ride, the wonderful sensation of reckless abandonment. It seemed to take them even less time than usual to reach Collier's Bay, and before Alex knew it, they were shooting toward the speck of light in the distance that was Johnson's cabin. "This time will go right by," he thought. No slowing down to take a look, just a blast of speed and noise, and they'd be up the shoreline and into the trees. A few seconds later they left the lake and were entering the clearing. There Alex risked one quick peek in the direction of the cabin, and in so doing almost piled into the back of Joel's sled. Alex yanked the handlebar hard to the right and hit the brake at the same time, sliding to a stop only a few feet from Joel's stalled snowmobile. Alex jumped from his machine. "What's happened?" Joel slowly dismounted, a puzzled expression on his face. "I'm not sure," he said. "The motor coughed a couple of times, then just died." Joel walked to the front of the snowmobile and lifted the engine cover. Even with the headlight from Alex's sled, it was impossible for them to see much of the motor. "Do you know what you're looking for?" Alex asked. "No idea," Joel said, bending closer to the engine. "Maybe we should go and get your dad. Your sled should be all right here for a while if we pull it off the trail. This is so close to Johnson's place, I don't think anyone will touch it. Hopefully it's just something minor, like a frozen fuel line or something," Joel said, sounding somewhat deflated. "Well, come on then. Let's move it off the trail." Alex was bending to grab one of the heavy metal skis protruding from the front when a sudden voice from the darkness froze him in his tracks. "What's going on here?" Alex and Joel wheeled in the direction of the unexpected voice. Shadowed in the darkness stood Johnson, silhouetted in the dim light of 1,000 stars. "The engine died," Joel explained haltingly. "It coughed a few times, then just conked out." Johnson eyed the boys suspiciously. "You're the same boys who were here the other night," he finally said. "That's right, Mr. Johnson," Alex said. "Looks like we're in trouble again." "We were just going back home to get my dad," Joel added. "He's fairly handy with machinery." "So am I," Johnson said, walking slowly up to the snowmobile. "Why don't I have a quick look? It's probably nothing much." "That'd be great, Mr. Johnson," Joel said, his voice sounding cheerful again. "We'd sure appreciate it." Johnson pulled a large flashlight from his coat, leaned across the motor and scanned the beam over the myriad of complicated-looking components. "Everything looks okay," he said, clicking off the flashlight and straightening up. "How about if I tow it over to my shop?" Joel and Alex looked at one another. "Ah, sure," Joel finally stammered. "I guess that would be all right." "What do you think could be wrong?" Alex asked. "It sounds kind of serious." "From what you said, it's probably water in the gas." "How did water get into our gas?" Joel asked. "Sabotage," Johnson said. "Somebody most likely put some snow in your tank." Chapter 8. Modified. Joel's disabled snowmobile was swiftly hooked to the back of Clarence's ski-doo and towed the short distance to the big shed behind Johnson's cabin. "What kind of building is this?" Alex asked as they approached the two large double doors. "We thought it was a barn." Johnson stepped wordlessly through the entrance and turned on a light switch. "I didn't think you had electricity," Alex said. "I do in here," Johnson replied. "I need power for light and to run my tools." He stepped behind the disabled snowmobile. "Let's get her inside, boys. All hands on deck." 3 sets of arms quickly manhandled the snowmobile through the open door and into the building. "Shut the door," Johnson said. "Keep the heat in." It was immediately evident to Alex that Johnson's building was indeed a garage. Its walls were lined with tools and mechanical equipment, and in the center of the floor, about 15 feet away, sat a sleek red sports car. A number of colorful decals were splashed across its body. 1956 Citroën, Johnson said proudly. "A French classic." "So this is a garage," Joel said. Johnson walked over to the workbench and rummaged through one of the toolboxes. He returned with a small plastic container. "Gas line antifreeze ought to do the trick," Johnson said. "It's a wonder you got this far." Alex scowled. "Who could have done that?" "Lance Higginson," Joel almost spat the words. "Who else?" "When could he have done it, though?" Alex asked as Johnson knelt over the front of the engine. "Maybe when we were visiting Clarence, or when we were having supper," Joel suggested, watching carefully as Johnson began work on the machine. "Had to be fairly recent," Johnson said, "but I didn't hear a snowmobile at Clarence's," Alex said. Johnson glanced over his shoulder. "Does the Higginson boy have a red Arctic cat?" "That's him," Joel said. Johnson grunted. Alex looked at the man curiously. "Do you know him?" "I know him." Johnson was silent as he poured the antifreeze into the gas tank. "You want to make this machine go faster?" he asked without looking up. Joel's eyes widened. "Could you do that?" "There's folks from all over who like to work the Citroens. Some of us also tinker with snowmobiles and motorbikes." A look of pride crossed his face. "If I run into trouble, I've got a couple of friends who'll help me out." Something twigged in Alex's mind. "Do you have a telephone?" "Shortwave radio," Johnson corrected. "We wondered about the aerial," Alex said, his face brightening. Johnson shrugged. "Big or small, a motor is a motor." He slapped a small pair of pliers absently against the palm of his hand. "Leave the sled with me until noon tomorrow. I've got to get a few parts in town. You got $20? Joel pulled out his wallet and handed Johnson the money. "Christmas money," he explained. "Are you sure that's all it'll cost?" "I can get used parts from a friend." "Why are you doing this?" Alex asked. Johnson led them to the door, opened it, and pointed out across the clearing. "In the summer I grow rhubarb over by the trees," he said. "That Higginson boy came through here last summer on his all-terrain vehicle and ran it through my patch. Did it on purpose and churned it up real good." "That sounds like him all right," Joel said. "He's real mean, a real bully." "Maybe it's time for him to be bullied back," Johnson said. By mid-afternoon the following day, Alex and Joel arrived back at Johnson's garage. The more-than-usual frazzled-looking Johnson quickly ushered them inside. "What exactly did you do?" Joel asked as he circled the machine. "It looks pretty much the same." "I tinkered a bit with the cylinders, increased the pressure on your skis, plus a couple of other little things." Joel took a long, deep breath. "It'll go faster." "It ought to give Higginson's Arctic cat a run for the money," Johnson said. "Give it a try." The snowmobile was already pointing toward the door, so Joel hopped on, turned the ignition, and guided the rumbling machine outside. Alex and Johnson followed close behind. Joel sat for a moment, revving the motor and listening to the new, more powerful sound. Slowly he squeezed the accelerator. The machine jumped forward with an angry howl. It shot out across the open area and down onto the lake, missing the trail and sending up a huge cloud of snow in its wake. "Wow!" Alex shouted as he watched the sled tear through the unbroken snow of the lake. "You really did super up. That's amazing. It sounds like you put a jet engine in there." He looked over at Johnson, and for one brief instant he was sure a faint smile flitted across the man's scraggly face. "Good enough." Alex hadn't really stopped to consider the similarities between Agnes Sprague and his grandmother until late that night. He lay in bed, tossing and turning in the darkness, Joel's soft snoring filling the small bedroom. Since meeting Agnes, he'd found himself thinking about his grandmother, especially some of the fun times they'd had together. Like his grandmother, Agnes was someone who believed in him. He knew that Grandma thought he was special, probably one of the reasons why he loved her so much. Even his dad had learned not to put him down in front of Grandma. She just wouldn't take it. If Grandma thought he was different, it was in a good way. He recalled her reminders of how many of the world's great people were kind of unique. He took a long, deep breath, wishing he could fall asleep and turn his mind off for another day. But how was he unique? He knew he wasn't much of a student. He found almost every subject to be a stretch. His grandmother hadn't really gotten into specifics about how being different could actually be a good thing. If only there was some way of proving to his dad that he was worth something and proving his grandmother right. Then he remembered, and his heart sank. She was gone, but he could still prove it to Agnes. Agnes believed in him, just like his grandmother had, and he could prove it to his dad too, but most especially he wanted to prove it to himself. But how? How could he ever do that? Chapter 9. The I.C.U. Alex flinched as he followed Joel into the emergency ward, the sickening antiseptic odours wafting over him. Memories of visiting his grandmother in the hospital last summer returned as they approached the nurses' station. "Can we see Agnes Sprague?" Joel asked. "She's in intensive care," the nurse replied, not even bothering to consult her chart. "Second floor to the right of the elevator, but I doubt if they'll let you visit her right now." Joel nodded. "That's okay. Her husband's there. We can visit with him." Alex found it difficult to comprehend all that had happened during the past hour. It was all so fast, much too fast. He and Joel had just arrived home for lunch when they found a note left by Joel's parents. "Boys, Agnes has had a heart attack. Come to town on your snowmobiles and meet us at the hospital." An image of Agnes in her hospital bed flashed through Alex's mind. He shuddered. Outside the door of the I.C.U, several chairs lined the walls of a small alcove. All were empty. The boys hesitated. "It looks like your parents have left," Alex said. He'd no sooner spoken when Clarence stepped from the intensive care unit. A thin smile creased his wrinkled face when he saw the boys. "Thanks for coming," he said, gripping each of them by the arm. "Your parents just left a few minutes ago, Joel." "How's Agnes?" Joel asked. "Sleeping," Clarence said. "Why don't you come in for a minute?" They followed the old man into the small, windowless room where Agnes lay sleeping. A myriad of wires and tubes connected her to a heart monitor on the wall. At the head of the bed, a nurse sat reading from a large clipboard. She looked up and smiled at the two newcomers. Alex and Joel stood for several wordless moments gazing down at the sleeping patient. Finally, Clarence let out a small sigh and ushered them back into the waiting room. "Was it a heart attack?" Alex asked when they were seated. Clarence nodded. "The doctors think so." Alex was at a loss for words. What could be said to this kind old man that would be of any comfort? He watched Clarence lean forward, rubbing his hands together as if he was holding them under a tap. "I thought Agnes was feeling better," Alex said. "She was. In fact, we were planning on going for a drive around the lake this afternoon. It was such a beautiful day." The door to the I.C.U opened and the nurse poked her head out. "She's awake, Mr. Sprague, and she's asking for you." Clarence jumped to his feet. You boys come in too." The nurse stopped them at the door. "Only a few minutes. I'll be at the nurse's station." Alex's heart raced as he re-entered the room. Agnes's eyes were still closed, but when Clarence gently lifted her hand into his, her eyelids fluttered open. For an instant she just stared blankly at the ceiling. Then slowly she turned and fastened her eyes on her husband's. Her face lit up in a warm smile as Clarence gently wiped a strand of long grey hair away from her face. "The boys dropped by to see how you were doing," he said. "They were worried about you." "How nice," she said in a surprisingly strong voice. "You gave us quite a scare, Agnes," Joel said. "Oh, don't you worry about me," she said with a soft smile. "I'm in good hands, you know that." Agnes looked straight into Alex's eyes, and he knew she wasn't just referring to the medical staff. "It is wonderful to know that no matter what happens to this old, worn-out body, I'm going to be all right," she said. Alex could only nod dumbly. Agnes paused for a moment as if collecting her strength. Despite the disappointments and heartache that life deals each of us, it is wonderful to know that the Good Shepherd is holding us in the palm of his hand. Alex smiled at the old woman. It was strangely comforting to hear Agnes's reassuring words. She sounded so sure and at peace with whatever happened. But then again she was old, and perhaps most old people made peace with their Creator. He thought once again of his grandmother. "We'd better go," Joel said, moving to the head of the bed and giving Agnes a gentle hug. "We'll come back tomorrow to see how you're doing." Agnes beckoned both boys close to her. Alex could tell that she was losing her strength. He leaned closer. "Think of what I've said, boys," she said in a voice that was now barely a whisper. "Following the Good Shepherd should begin when you're young, like it did for me. The Lord Jesus wants us to be his disciples all through our lives. Don't wait until you're old and all used up before you decide." Clarence escorted them out of the I.C.U. and back into the little alcove. "Thanks for coming, boys. We sure appreciate your thoughtfulness." Alex and Joel slowly made their way back down the sterile corridors and out into the afternoon sun. "Man," Joel muttered, "that was depressing. I hate hospitals." "You were right about Agnes," Alex said as they started down the trail to where they'd left their snowmobiles. "She really is bent on converting us." He hesitated as they arrived at their sleds. "But that's to be expected, I guess. When you get as old and frail as Agnes, you probably think a lot about the great beyond." "Nah," Joel disagreed. "I think Agnes has always been like that, even when she was young." Alex grinned. "You're probably right. Let's make a mental note to have this same conversation in 50 years. Joel pulled on his helmet. "What do you say?" Alex laughed. "Agreed. Right now we've got something more important to worry about, and that's beating Lance Higginson." "Amen." Joel turned the ignition. "I now know for a certainty that I can beat this guy. We were already close, even before Johnson's modifications, and for sure I'm a better driver than old Higginson." Alex dropped into his seat, turned on the engine, and followed Joel down the narrow trail out of town. When they pulled up to the starting gate a few minutes later, his heart sank. Lance Higginson was sitting astride his snowmobile watching as they approached. Wordlessly, Joel and Alex maneuvered their machines up to the starting line, one on either side of the red Arctic cat. They sat for a moment, silently eyeing their adversary. With a sly smirk, Lance stretched both arms in front of him and yawned loudly. He then turned to the sleek Polaris. "Done a little tinkering, I hear?" Joel squinted silently at the other boy. "If it's any consolation to you ladies," Lance continued, "it looks like you're going to be my main competition. I had a look at the list of racers, and I've never seen such a pathetic bunch of losers." "That's encouraging," Joel said sarcastically. Alex could feel the blood rushing to his face. No matter how hard he tried, Lance always seemed to get his dander up. "How about putting up right now?" he said in a low voice. "I think you're all blow, and your sled's all show." Lance's face brightened. "You serious?" "You must be getting a little bored running this course all by yourself," Joel taunted. "Even Sunday drivers enjoy a little competition now and then." Lance settled back into his seat and turned the ignition. "Bring it on!" he shouted. Alex looked over at Joel. "Show him how it's done. I'll do my best to keep up." He climbed to his feet, stepped up onto the running boards, then raised his right arm high above his head. When both Joel and Lance were looking his way, he brought his arm quickly down to his side. Both snow machines jumped forward as if hurled from a catapult. Alex dropped back into his seat and jammed the accelerator. Still, by the time he reached the beaver pond, the other two sleds were already opening a large gap between themselves and him, and before he'd reached the mile 2 marker, there was no sign of the other racers. Clarence's old Ski-Doo was just no match. Despite the obvious disadvantage, he didn't give up, pressing every ounce of power from the machine and every bit of skill from his driving abilities. He was approaching an especially sharp curve at mile 3 when he noticed something in the snow beside the trail ahead of him. He eased off the accelerator as he started into the curve, his eyes glued on the approaching object. It wasn't until he was about 50 feet away that he realized that it was Joel's black Polaris lying on its side a few feet off the trail. Alex slammed on his brake and jumped from the snowmobile. Yanking off his helmet, he charged into the waist-deep snow. Behind the upturned sled and next to a thick poplar tree lay Joel. His face was ashen, and he was gripping his right leg with both hands. "What happened?" Joel groaned, rocking back and forth. Alex dropped to his knees beside his friend. "What happened?" he repeated. "Lance forced me off the trail," Joel said between gritted teeth. "I think my leg's broken." "Are you bleeding anywhere?" Joel shook his head. "It's just my leg." "I'll get you to the hospital," Alex said. "Can you stand if you lean on me?" Joel's teeth were already chattering. "I can't sit here any longer. I'm freezing." Alex went around behind Joel and dragged him through the snow to Clarence's Ski-Doo. Joel groaned again as Alex put an arm around his waist and hauled him up onto the back of the snowmobile, his left leg resting awkwardly on the running board. Alex then plunged back through the snow to the Polaris and retrieved the ignition key so no one could drive off with it. "I'll come back and get your sled later," he said as he saw Joel eyeing his snowmobile worriedly. "Did you say that Lance forced you off the course?" Joel nodded, steadying his leg with both hands. "I could have taken him too, Alex. I know I could have. I had him. He's totally nowhere as a driver. He's all over the place." Alex took his seat behind the steering column. "I'll drive as carefully as I can," he said, "but it'll still be a rough trip back to town." Several miles of sharp corners and a multitude of bone-jarring bumps followed. By the time they arrived at the hospital, Joel's face had lost all its colour, and his head hung so low that it almost touched his chest. Alex was just pulling up to the emergency entrance when the glass doors flew open and an attendant raced out, pushing a wheelchair. "We heard your snowmobile," he explained. "I think his leg's broken," Alex said. Together they gently lifted Joel into the wheelchair and hurried him into the hospital. "You wait here," the attendant ordered as they reached the waiting room. Alex dropped into a chair, breathless. He leaned forward, his arms resting on his knees. He was shaking. "I'd better give Joel's folks a call," he thought. Slowly he got to his feet and crossed over to a payphone by the exit. His mind was numb, but somehow when Mrs. Flynn answered the phone, he managed to explain what had happened. When he finished, there was a pause on the other end of the line, and he could hear Mrs. Flynn relaying the message to her husband. "We'll be right down," she said. "He's going to be okay, Mrs. Flynn," Alex reassured her. "His leg may not even be broken." Mrs. Flynn hesitated for a moment. "Oh, Alex, I'm afraid I have some bad news. Clarence called a few minutes ago from the hospital. Agnes died shortly after your visit." Chapter 10. The Coach. Alex stood for a moment as the news of Agnes's death sank in. He returned the phone to its cradle and sagged into a nearby chair. How could this have happened? He was numb. He sat for what seemed like an eternity, checking his watch and glancing down the hallway toward the emergency room every few minutes. Finally, Joel's parents rushed in, Mary Flynn looking especially frazzled. "Why didn't Lance stop and see if Joel was all right?" Jack Flynn asked, after Alex had again explained what had happened. "Joel could have been killed." The door beside the nurse's station banged open, and an exhausted-looking doctor entered the waiting room. He dropped into a chair across from the Flynns and exhaled loudly. "I have good news and bad news," he began. "First of all, your son femur is not broken, just badly bruised. Second, he does have a dislocated patella, or kneecap, so we fixed that problem and fitted him with a temporary brace. Unfortunately, it will take a few weeks for it to heal properly. He'll need to get around on crutches for a while." The doctor glanced at his watch. "You can see him in about an hour. He's sedated right now." "He's entered in a snowmobile race in a few days," Alex said. "I'm afraid that's out of the question." When they were alone, Mary Flynn reached into her purse, drew out a handkerchief, and dabbed her eyes. "So much for the thunder rally," Alex said. "Thank goodness," Mary Flynn said. "Was his snowmobile wrecked?" Jack Flynn asked. "I only had time for a quick look," Alex said. "But it seemed okay. Joel was thrown from it and his leg must have slammed into a tree." "I'll make arrangements to have his sled brought home," Jack Flynn said. Alex was suddenly anxious to do something, anything to get out of that place. Jack Flynn nodded, his expression betraying the fact that his mind was miles away. "That would be fine, Alex." He got to his feet. "I just can't get over the fact that Lance Higginson didn't even stop to see if Joel was okay." "Do you think we should call the police?" his wife asked. Jack considered the question for a moment. "No," he finally answered. "After all, it's possible that Lance may not have noticed that Joel was injured. Besides, it would certainly make it awkward if we got the police involved. It's a small community." "I'd better go get the sled," Alex said. "You'll need help," Jack Flynn objected. "Who's going to drive Joel's machine?" "I know someone who'll give me a hand." With a quick nod, he was out the door, back on the ski-doo, and enjoying the cool winter wind on his face. He wasn't sure why he thought Johnson might help him, but somehow he knew the strange little man would. When he and Johnson arrived at Joel's abandoned sled on Clarence's ski-doo, the Polaris was exactly as Alex had left it, lying on its side just off the trail. "Seems okay," Johnson said after they had turned it back onto its treads and given it the once-over. "Your friend must have turned too sharp and been tossed into that tree." He nodded toward the base of the poplar where a large impression was visible in the snow. "Lance Higginson forced him off the trail," Alex explained, slipping the key into the ignition of the Polaris. As the big engine roared to life, Johnson nodded. "Sounds fine. I'll follow you to your friend's place, then you can give me a lift home." After dropping the Polaris off at the Flynn's place, the trip to Johnson's shack seemed to take forever. Alex's mind was a turmoil as he considered again what had happened to Joel and the role that Lance had played. And Agnes. He couldn't get her gentle face out of his mind. Why had her death hit him so hard? He'd just met her, for crying out loud. Maybe it was because she reminded him so much of his own grandmother. When he finally pulled up to Johnson's shack, his mind was still tumbling over and over, "How did you like the way the Polaris handled?" Johnson asked, climbing off the ski-doo. "Real smooth," Alex acknowledged. "Lots more power than this old girl." "What are you going to do now that your friend's out of the race?" Johnson asked, a sly grin on his face. "What can we do? The doctor made it very clear that he was not to race." Johnson grunted. "Someone's going to have to take the bull by the horns then." "And how would someone do that?" Alex asked sarcastically. "Drive," Johnson said bluntly, shaking his bushy head. "You can do it. I watched the way you handled the sled on the way here." "Oh no, Joel is a real ace. He had an honest shot at winning the Thunder Rally. I'd look like an amateur out there with all the other racers. I've never raced before." "Neither has your friend or the Higginson boy." "But they've been practicing." "All you need to win a race like the Thunder Rally is to have an edge," Johnson said, "and I might be able to help you out in that department." "Help me out?" Johnson nodded, his eyes narrowing. "I'm a mechanic by trade, but I know a thing or two about racing, mainly cars, but it's really not much difference whatever machine you're driving." "I don't know, Mr. Johnson. If I had to lose, I'd hate to lose to a creep like Lance Higginson." "Don't lose, then. You want to see him get beaten, don't you? Especially after what he did to your friend?" "Of course." "Let's take this old ski-doo out for a ride," Johnson suggested. "It'll do fine until you get your friend's okay to race his Polaris." "I doubt if Joel will let me race his sled. Joel has never even offered me a chance to drive it." "Take us back up the trail," Johnson said, dropping into the seat behind Alex. "Don't worry about speed for now. You won't be able to go too fast with a passenger anyhow." Alex pulled back onto the trail, keeping the machine at a moderate speed. Johnson tapped him on the shoulder as they approached the first bend. "Lean more with the turn," Johnson shouted over the roar of the motor. Alex leaned toward the bend. "More!" Johnson yelled. "You've got to really lean to keep your speed. Try the next one." As the snowmobile roared into the next curve, Alex leaned hard to the left, hanging out over the machine as it swung into the sharp turn. Johnson stayed quiet for the next few twists in the course, then tapped Alex on the shoulder again. "You're doing good, but you've got to keep more to the inside of these turns." On the next bend, Alex cut the corner even sharper, so close to the edge of the trail that his helmet actually brushed a few branches. Several bends later, Johnson hollered, "When you have a real sharp bend like the last one, try accelerating as you start into the turn, then real quick tap the brake. That'll swing the back of the sled out a bit. Once you feel it going, hit the gas hard." For the next 2 hours they practiced. They practiced until Alex's right hand ached from squeezing the accelerator and his ears hummed from the constant roar of the engine. "Talk to your friend about entering the race for him," Johnson said when they finally pulled back into his yard. "Then get out on the trail and practice every chance you get." Chapter 11. A Change of Plans. Alex sat staring at the floor, his mind a million miles from the Flynn's living room. "It hasn't sunk in yet, I reckon," Clarence was saying. "Not after spending every day with someone for half a century. It sure is going to be different." "Well, I'm so relieved that you were able to have supper with us this evening," Mary Flynn said. "And it's wonderful to have Joel home from the hospital. I was afraid the doctor was going to keep him in overnight." "It's good to be home, believe me," Joel said, propping his injured leg up on a stool. "Alex and I were just saying how much we hate hospitals, and then I end up in the emergency ward on the business end of things." "It could have been a lot worse," his mother said. "I think it's crazy to go so fast on those machines. You're lucky you weren't killed." "Are you absolutely sure that Lance forced you off the trail?" his dad asked for the third time. Joel nodded. "We were running neck and neck and were coming up to this sharp bend. He caught my eye and gave me a little grin. Then he steered right into me. One of my skis caught something on the edge of the trail, and I sailed over the windscreen and crashed into that stupid tree." Alex scrunched further down in his seat. It seemed like a huge cloud was hovering over him. Nothing about the last few days made any sense. Clarence rose from his chair and crossed over to the couch where Alex was sitting. "I think I know how you're feeling, young fella," he said, patting Alex's arm. "Life can be mighty aggravating at times. It's curious how things seem to go along pretty good for quite a spell, then all of a sudden, bang, everything that possibly could go wrong goes wrong." He stopped for a moment and stared vacantly into the fireplace. "And then things turn around and gradually go back to a kind of normal. And you know what I've found? When the good times return, you kind of forget how terrible you felt when things weren't going good. Right now it would appear that all of us are going through a particularly rough spot." Alex set his jaw. "What about Agnes?" he asked, looking directly into the old man's eyes. "She had more than a few weeks of bad luck. She suffered with her arthritis for years, with only you and a bunch of chickadees to keep her company. Why did God allow that to happen to her? He couldn't have asked for a better Christian." A faint smile crossed the old man's face. "Well, that's one way of looking at things, all right, but I know for a fact that's not how Agnes saw it." He leaned back on the couch. "Have you ever given any thought to your own funeral, Alex?" Alex looked at the old man in surprise. "Not really." "Agnes gave it plenty of thought," Clarence said. "She saw it as her last chance to let folks know how important Jesus Christ was in her life." "But why?" Alex asked. "I mean, everybody says that if you don't have your health, you don't have anything." Clarence grinned. "I don't think Agnes ever felt that her aches and pains were all that important. Now I can't give you an answer as to why her faith was so strong, because I've hardly been sick a day in my life. But I know that the weaker and sicker she got, the stronger her faith seemed to grow." Mary Flynn pulled a chair up to the couch. "Agnes was a remarkable woman. You would think that someone who suffered as much as she did would really question whether God loved her. But I think she was the most contented woman I've ever known." "And she was always trying to convert me," Joel added. "It was kind of nice that she worried so much about me." "And," Clarence said with a grin, "she's going to give it one last try, Joel. That's the kind of funeral she wanted. Share her faith one last time." Joel laughed. "I'll listen carefully, Clarence. She deserves an honest chance." There was an awkward pause, each person lost in the privacy of their own memories. Finally, Clarence cleared his throat and turned to Joel. "It's a real shame you're going to miss the big race." "Yeah," Joel said. "I was really looking forward to cleaning Higginson's clock." "Why not let Alex drive for you?" Clarence suggested. "He's been getting lots of practice." "Let the rookie drive?" Joel looked over at his friend. "Would you be interested? Do you think you could handle my machine?" Alex could feel his heart begin to race. "I think we'd better forget about the Thunder Rally for this year." His friend was quiet for another minute, watching as Alex slouched even further into the couch. A sly grin crossed his face. "Actually, having you in the race is a great idea. I hear our wild-eyed hermit friend has been giving you a bit of coaching. Was he any help?" "He knows his stuff," Alex admitted. "Then I think you ought to do it," Joel said. "It's not likely anyone will beat old Lance anyway, but it would be nice if somebody gave him a run for his money. According to him, there is no one else in the race that has a chance." "Well, then it's settled," Clarence said. "Alex, you've still got a couple of days before the race. You can squeeze a lot of practice into 48 hours if you have to." Alex suddenly felt very awkward. "I'll sure give it my best shot." Joel punched his friend lightly on the shoulder. "You'd better," he said, the smile back on his face. "Otherwise, when I go back to school after the holidays, I'll have to listen to Higginson brag his head off for the rest of the winter. Mary Flynn returned from the kitchen with a plate of oatmeal cookies. You know, Clarence, you've never told us how you and Agnes met. She hinted that it was quite an amusing story. Clarence shifted self-consciously. Now that takes me back, he said slowly. Sometimes it seems like yesterday, and then at other times it seems like 100 years ago. So how did you meet? Mary Flynn persisted. Well, you might find it difficult to believe, Clarence began. But 50 years ago I wasn't the same debonair gentleman that I am today. He grinned at the others. After I got out of the army, I came up here and found work in the lumber camps. When spring came, I decided to visit my brother in the city, and it just so happened he was staying at a rooming house owned by Agnes and her mother. Well, there I was, just off the train. Beard down to my belly button, bush clothes. Mary Flynn laughed with delight. Oh, Clarence, you must have looked a sight. I was for a fact, Clarence agreed. But not knowing any better, I walked right up to the front door of the rooming house, bold as brass. You know, I'll never forget seeing Agnes for the first time when she answered the door. There she stood, dark hair down to her shoulders, light cotton dress. She looked so pretty that even after all these years the thought of her still takes my breath away. He reached for a cookie and took a minute to collect himself. Do you know what my future wife's first words to me were? He asked. I'll bet they were romantic, Mary Flynn said. Clarence laughed. Not exactly, he said. She took one look at me and said, if you would like to go around to the back door, my mother will fix you a sandwich. She thought you were looking for a handout, Joel said, laughing. Clarence nodded. She sure did. But I said no. I'm here to see my brother, Charlie. Agnes was so embarrassed. She put her hand over her mouth and her face turned red. Clarence shook his head. Imagine me embarrassing her. I'll bet that wasn't the last time, though, Joel said. The others all laughed. So what happened then? Alex asked. Did you ask her out? Clarence shook his head. Not right away, young fella. I was pretty shy back then, believe it or not. I had to build up my courage. So I cut off the beard and got into some city clothes. But from the first moment I saw her, I made up my mind that one day I was going to ask her to marry me. And I did. Not bad for an uncouth lad from the lumber camps. Not bad, Clarence, Joel agreed. Married for a half-century, Clarence continued. Been my faithful partner since the first day we met. That's quite the love story, Clarence, Mary Flynn said. But it isn't hard to imagine you as such a romantic. They were quiet again. The funeral is tomorrow afternoon, then? Alex finally asked. Clarence nodded. 2:00. I spent most of the day delivering invitations to the folk living around Kenogami. I'm sure it will be well attended, Mary Flynn said. Agnes was a very special lady. Is a special lady, Clarence corrected gently. Chapter 12. A Focus. Breakfast was barely over when the bright, peaceful morning was shattered with the roar of a snowmobile just outside the Flynn house. It's a little early for Higginson to be out on the trails, Joel muttered with a scowl. Alex got up from the table and peered out the window. It's not Lance, he said. It's Johnson, and he's driving a real hot sled. Alex and Mary Flynn arrived at the door just as Johnson knocked. Come in. Alex ushered their guest inside. Johnson removed his helmet and stood silently in the foyer. Morning, Mr. Johnson. Joel gave him a wave from the kitchen table. Johnson nodded. Is that a new machine you're driving? Alex asked. I borrowed it from a friend, Johnson explained. Joel is going to let me use his sled in the big race, Alex said. Figured he would, but there's one more thing you need to do to get ready. What might that be? Joel asked from the kitchen. You need to race against somebody that will give you a run for your money, like the Higginson boy will be doing. Mary Flynn glanced at Alex, a worried expression crossing her face. "Agnes's funeral is this afternoon, Alex. You wouldn't want to miss that." "Of course not," Alex said, looking questioningly at Johnson. "How long do you think we'll be?" "A couple of hours, then a couple more hours after the funeral. The race is tomorrow, isn't it?" Alex turned back to Joel. "What do you think?" "Go for it." Joel struggled to his feet and hobbled over to a chair by the living room window. "Don't worry, Mom. There's no tree with Alex's name on it." A strange hollowness overcame Alex as he pulled on his outdoor clothes. "Why don't you enter the race yourself?" he asked Johnson. "From the look of the sled you're driving, I'd say you had an excellent chance of winning, especially with what you know about racing." "Nope," Johnson said. "It's got to be someone his own age that beats this Higginson kid." With that, he opened the door and stepped outside. "Be careful, Alex," Mary Flynn warned. Alex scooped up his helmet and followed Johnson out into the cold winter morning. It was brisk and perfectly cloudless, ideal weather for a ride in the forest. Johnson's machine was a beaut. It was dark green with a thin red racing stripe down both sides. Yamaha was painted in bold red letters across the hood. "Wow," Alex said. "Top of the line," Johnson agreed. "Should give your beast a run for its money." "Especially with you driving," Alex said, starting the engine of the Polaris. He glanced up at the living room window. A pang of guilt stabbed him when he saw Joel looking out at them. He wished that somehow both he and Joel could enter the race this week. Not having Joel along took most of the fun out of it. "We'll go back to town and do a practice run," Johnson shouted. "When we reach the starting line, I'll give you a 5-second head start. Make sure you keep in front of me until the end of the race." With that, he gassed the engine and shot off down the trail. The power of Joel's Polaris was awesome. It was as if a huge animal was caged under the hood, anxious to tear up the freshly groomed course before them. In the 15 minutes it took them to reach town, they passed only 2 other riders, no doubt a major factor in Johnson's choice of such an early hour. At the starting line, Alex's self-appointed coach turned off the Yamaha's engine and removed his helmet, bushels of hair immediately springing to attention. He waited while Alex pulled up beside him, then leaned forward, his piercing dark eyes burrowing into Alex's. "Stay focused," he said. "Focus on each and every part of the course. Eke out every bit of speed and every little advantage you can. Don't worry about whether I'm behind you, beside you, or a mile ahead of you. Focus on what you're doing. I'm a better driver than Lance Higginson will ever be, just remember that. And whatever you do—" Johnson paused, his dark eyes never leaving Alex's. "Don't let me pass you." With that, he pulled his helmet back on and restarted the Yamaha. Alex drew in several deep breaths of air, wishing with all his might that Joel had never got hurt. He had sensed his friend's growing resentment at missing the race, and he didn't blame Joel one bit. Worst of all, he felt his own personal sense of failure. He knew he would never be able to stay ahead of Johnson, and he didn't stand a chance against Lance Higginson either, even on Joel's souped-up Polaris. He could almost hear the other racers laughing at the city boy. With a last deep breath, he glanced back at his strange-looking mentor and nodded reluctantly. The Polaris jumped forward with an ear-shattering roar. The acceleration was so swift that Alex was yanked backward. Gripping the handlebars with all his might, he shot down the straight stretch and then swiftly into the long, sweeping curve that skirted the beaver pond. He found himself counting 3, 4, 5. Johnson would now be leaving the starting post, charging down the straight stretch on his powerful green Yamaha. Alex was suddenly filled with an overpowering desire to impress Johnson so that Joel would hear how well he had done. "Keep to the inside," a voice told him. He eased the accelerator and swung into the first of a long series of sweeping bends. accelerate into the turn. He leaned far out over the trail as he roared into the curve, then swung himself quickly to the other side of his sled as the next curve veered the opposite way. The exhilaration of the moment raced through him like a giant tidal wave. He wanted to scream, to shout at the top of his lungs and hear his voice echo back from the snow-covered trees and hills. He glanced quickly into the rearview mirror, but there was still no sign of the Yamaha. "Focus," Johnson had said. And that's what he did, riveting his concentration on each bend, on every foot of the winding racecourse. Only twice in the first couple of miles did he have to contend with other snowmobiles on the trail, and he felt a wild sense of pride as he roared by them. It was not until he neared Lake Kenogami that he became aware of the steady sound of another engine behind him. He glanced quickly into the mirror and caught sight of Johnson, barely a length behind. A surge of excitement rippled through him. A long, straight stretch lay before them, so he pushed the accelerator down the last fraction, and for an instant Johnson vanished. Then, to Alex's astonishment, the Yamaha suddenly appeared on the opposite side of his machine, edging up beside him just as they were barreling down on another sweeping bend. Keep to the inside. A sense of frustration swept through him. How could he gain the edge when Johnson had crowded in beside him? And worst of all, the Yamaha now held the inside track and the advantage. Lean as far out as possible. But he couldn't even do that because the green Yamaha was in the way, right there next to him. In a heartbeat he was into the corner, Johnson's sled creeping slowly into the lead. Accelerate into the turn. But unable to lean, Alex knew his speed was maxed out. A wave of frustration passed through him as Johnson rounded the curve a full sled length ahead of him. By the time they were a mile from the finish line, Johnson had opened up a 20-foot lead, and Alex knew that the race was lost. "Keep it close," he told himself. "Don't let him think you're a loser. Don't let him embarrass you." He wondered now if Johnson was giving it his all, because from there to the finish line, Alex was able to keep the lead from growing. At the finish line, he was greeted by a beaming Johnson. 28 minutes, 25 seconds, he said. Alex turned off the ignition. His arms, shoulders, even the fingers of his right hand ached. He flexed them gingerly. "I didn't stand a chance," he said, unable to meet Johnson's gaze. "Course not," Johnson said. "You've been racing for how long? A week? I've been racing for 30 years, and I still only beat you by 3 seconds. Alex looked up at him. "Were you trying?" "Were you?" "Of course." "Did you focus?" "I tried." "Not hard enough," Johnson said bluntly. "You didn't keep ahead of me, and you don't know the course good enough." "What?" Alex could feel his face flush. "I've been over this course at least a dozen times." "Then why did you let me have the inside track? That cost you the race." Alex stared at him for a moment. "You forced your way. Once you have the lead on another racer, you've got to do whatever it takes to stay there. You've got to keep checking your mirrors and over both your shoulders. Anticipate the other driver's moves and cut him off." Johnson dropped back into his seat. "We'll try it again," he said. "How are you for gas?" "We filled up last night," Alex said. There was something about Johnson that reminded him of Mr. Williams, his Phys-Ed teacher, and that made him remember the dream he'd had of his dad being Mr. Williams. A small shudder passed through him. "Let's get going," he said, flexing his fingers. "We've got our work cut out for us." Agnes's funeral was only a few hours away, and he was now afraid there just wasn't enough time between now and the race to learn all he needed to know to stand a chance against Lance Higginson. Chapter 13. Remembering Agnes. Alex had been expecting a stuffy funeral chapel, with a black-robed minister droning on and on, but the memorial service for Agnes wasn't anything like he had imagined. To begin with, it took place on a hill a short walk from the south end of Lake Kenogami. The snow in the clearing had been packed down with snowshoes the previous day, so it would freeze hard overnight, and a large bonfire blazed welcomingly. By the time Alex arrived with the Flynns, a fair-sized crowd had gathered. "There are a lot of people here I don't know," Joel said. "Word must have spread beyond Kenogami." "What a spectacular view," Alex said, warming his hands by the fire. Almost the entire length of Lake Kenogami stretched out below them on one side, and a long, tree-covered glen on the other. Joel hobbled up beside him, leaning heavily on his crutches and panting slightly. "Almost worth the effort. Except for a bit of wind, this is the perfect day." "There must be more than 100 people here," Alex said. "Lance's parents are here." Joel pointed out a tall, round-faced couple. Now where could Lance be? "It's a nice crowd," Mary Flynn agreed. "Clarence has been out delivering personal invitations to everyone, and I see some of Agnes's out-of-town friends are here. Afterward, we're all invited over to the community hall for coffee and sandwiches." A tall, fair-haired man with piercing blue eyes and a square, determined-looking jaw accompanied Clarence over to a spot by the fire, shaking hands with everyone in their path. For some reason, the newcomer reminded Alex of pictures he'd seen of Western gunfighters. "That's Jess Wheeler," Jack Flynn informed the boys. "He's a miner, lay preacher, and a long-time friend of Clarence and Agnes." "There are more people here than I expected," Mary Flynn remarked. "Agnes hasn't been able to get out for the past few years, and sometimes people get forgotten." "Agnes was someone who was very hard to forget," her husband said. A hush fell over the group as Clarence turned to face the gathering. "Come up close to the fire, folks," he said in a loud voice, beckoning them forward with a wave of his hand. The crowd pulled into a tight circle around Clarence and the lay preacher. "Folks, I'd like you to meet a good friend of mine. This here is Jess Wheeler." The tall man grinned broadly, tipping his head toward the crowd of people. "Agnes asked Jess to say a few words today," Clarence continued. "We thought it would be a good idea if we remembered Agnes up here on this hillside. This is where we love to come and enjoy God's handiwork. Sometimes we'd bring a picnic lunch." He turned to Jess. "Go ahead, my friend." Jess Wheeler pulled a small black Bible from his coat pocket and cleared his throat. "Some of you might be wondering how we can have a funeral service without a body or casket. Some might even consider it disrespectful." Alex looked up. He had just been thinking that very thing. There were just so many things about this funeral service that were a bit strange. "Well, those of us who knew Agnes best can assure you that the absence of her casket wouldn't matter to her in the least. You see, the Agnes we all loved has moved on. It doesn't matter where her body might be resting at the moment, for she has already made herself at home in a much better place than even this beautiful spot." Jess opened his Bible and leafed quickly to a place near the back. "Agnes's favourite verses have extra meaning today. 'Behold, I show you a mystery. We will not all sleep, but we shall all be changed. In a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, at the last trump. For the trumpet shall sound, and the dead shall be raised incorruptible, and we shall be changed. O death, where is thy sting? O grave, where is thy victory?'" These verses were important to Agnes because they told her that death had no power over her soul and spirit, that when her life came to an end, she would immediately go to be with her Lord Jesus. Alex found his thoughts going back to his first visit with Agnes, only a few short days ago. He remembered Joel's comment about waiting until he was older before considering becoming a Christian. He glanced over at his friend. Joel was staring stoically ahead, eyes fixed on Jess Wheeler. On his other side, Mrs. Flynn was busy wiping away tears as Jess continued his eulogy. Agnes Sprague was born Agnes Marjorie Kelsey 73 years ago in Toronto. Agnes was an only child, and for the past few years, Clarence has been her only family member. To countless hospital patients and shut-ins, Agnes was a faithful and caring ministering angel, who for many years provided comfort and encouragement to the less fortunate during their times of need. Although Agnes lived here on Lake Kenogami for 50 years and wasn't able to get out much lately, she always thought of herself as a traveller. To Agnes, life was a journey, and her final destination was heaven. A few years ago, Agnes told me about a canoe trip she and Clarence had taken in the far north, just after they were married. For over a month they canoed the great rivers of the Arctic, miles from civilization. They spent 10 hours a day in their canoe, enduring blistered hands, hordes of mosquitoes, and torrential rains. Afterwards, she said that it was the happiest month of her life. That was the kind of woman Agnes was, enduring. Whether it meant putting up with the elements on a month-long canoe trip or tolerating painful arthritis for many long years, she was able to see far beyond the trials of the day. Like most people, she had troubles and hardships along the way, probably more than most of us will ever have to bear. But she always kept her eyes on the Good Shepherd and trusted him. All of us find it necessary at times to persevere through various troubles that life dishes out, but an important part of the process is making good choices, and the most important decision we will ever make is whether to accept or reject the Lord Jesus Christ as our own personal Saviour, for that is a choice we will live with for eternity. Another of Agnes's favourite verses is also my favourite, John 3:16. For God so loved the world, that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him should not perish, but have eternal life. Agnes knew Christianity was a very personal thing, Jess continued. No one is born a Christian. It's a one-on-one commitment to faith in Jesus Christ, and doesn't depend on who our parents were or what country we were born in or even what church we attend. Just as Agnes knew that Jesus had committed himself to her, she committed herself to him. That was what her life was all about. Jess Wheeler put his arm around Clarence's shoulders. It was Clarence who continued the eulogy. My dear wife wanted one last opportunity to share her faith with you, so that you might walk with Jesus as she did. We're here to remember her, to honour her life, and to let everyone hear one last time what her Saviour, Jesus Christ, meant to her. He paused for a few seconds. Where do you stand? As Clarence asked the question, he seemed to turn and look directly into Alex's eyes. Alex swallowed hard. It was as if this old man could see inside him, especially at moments like this, when his mind was in turmoil. He felt Joel's elbow dig into his ribs. She's even trying to convert us at her funeral, he whispered. Alex managed a weak smile, but the words of Jess and Clarence echoed within him, and he knew that Agnes' influence through these two men would never, ever leave him. Getting the feel. Alex sat at the Flynn's dining room table, poring over Clarence's topographic map, memorizing each twist and turn of the Thunder Rally's course, anything unique about the winding trail that could possibly give him an advantage. The hills, swamps, ravines, rivers and lakes recalling in his mind's eye each section of the course. He could imagine the big Polaris beneath him thundering down the snow-packed trail, the wind whipping up under his face protector and stinging his cheeks. The distinctive howl it emitted when accelerating down a straight stretch and roaring over a mogul, sailing through the air like a rocket ship. Suddenly, an overpowering sense of anxiety rushed through him. The Thunder Rally was scheduled for the day after tomorrow, and he wasn't ready. He needed more time, more practice. Johnson's coaching was only just beginning to sink in and pay off. How had he ever gotten himself into this? The last thing he needed right now was to feel more like a failure than he already was. Chapter 14. Main Street Melee. The main street of the town of Kirkland Lake was strung with Christmas lights from end to end. Despite the late evening hour, the stores they passed in Mr. Flynn's half-ton truck were alive with shoppers. "When you're finished, meet me down the street at the grocery mart," Mr. Flynn said, pulling to a stop in front of the hardware store. "I'll be about a half hour." "Sure, Dad." Joel swung his injured leg out the truck door and waited while Alex handed him his crutches. "This is brutal," he grumbled. "I'll be so glad to see the last of these things." He waved the crutches over his head. "Didn't the doctor say you might be able to get a less restrictive brace in a couple of weeks?" "That is one consolation of living up here in the north. There's lots of snowmobiling weather left." Kirkland Lake Hardware was a large, sprawling store set back from the main drag. Joel led the way through a myriad of shelves to one marked snowmobiles, parts and accessories. "I really wonder if these fuel additives do anything," Alex said as Joel selected a container from the shelf. "For higher octane power and better fuel efficiency," Joel read from the red plastic bottle. "This may be just the little extra we need, even the smallest edge at this point." Suddenly he grabbed Alex by the arm and dragged him behind one of the shelves, almost knocking over a stack of hockey equipment in the process. "Lance Higginson," he whispered, nodding toward the door. "He's here with a friend." Alex peered between the rows of merchandise. Lance and a stocky, dark-haired boy were just going through the checkout. "Who's with him?" Alex whispered. "Herman Rutledge. He's almost as big a creep as Lance." Alex watched the two boys saunter from the store. "I wonder if he's in the race too." "Nah," Joel said, hobbling out from behind the shelf. "Herman's only interested in flexing his muscles and lifting weights." They checked their purchases with the clerk, then stepped out into the cool evening air. Alex drew his collar up to his ears. "Feels like more snow," he said as they started toward the grocery store. He glanced at his friend, anxious to say something positive. "You're really getting handy on those crutches." Joel was swinging his way down the street almost faster than Alex could keep up, seeming to enjoy the sympathetic glances of those passing by. They were approaching a large abandoned building on a quiet section of the street when two shadowy figures stepped from the alley directly in front of them. "Well, looky here," came a familiar voice. Alex groaned. "Lance Higginson." "We saw you back in the hardware store," Lance said, "shopping for magic formulas and secret potions to make your sled go faster, I'll bet." He poked Alex in the chest with his finger. "Herman was telling me that our little friend here signed up to take your place in the big race tomorrow." He threw back his head and laughed. "Guess what, ladies? They arranged the heats alphabetically, so Lance Higginson and Alex Gray will be riding in the same heat." Herman Rutledge took a step closer to Alex and Joel. "Looks like these bird brains really will need some magic potions just to keep from getting killed." He and Lance laughed hysterically. Alex stepped forward, his eyes blazing. "You forced Joel off the course, Higginson. Then you didn't even stop to see if he was hurt. We could have you arrested." He felt his friend's hand on his elbow. "Oh," Herman said. "Did the little baby break his toe? You could kill someone driving like that," Alex shouted. "Oh, shut your trap," Lance shouted, his laughter coming to an abrupt halt. "Remember the motto of the pirates, boys. No quarter asked, none given." "You deliberately knocked me out of the race," Joel said in a low voice. "And you were the one who sabotaged my sled the other night." A shopper edged by them on the sidewalk. Alex could see Lance's lip turn up and his eyes narrow. "I'd like to see you prove that." In 2 quick steps he was on top of Joel, grabbing the front of his coat and pushing him violently backward. Joel hit the ground with a crash, crutches flying. Alex charged straight at Lance, driving his head into the other boy's chest, knocking him backward, his arms flailing helplessly before landing in a snowbank with Alex on top of him. Alex rolled off his adversary and was scrambling back to his feet when he felt a heavy hand grab him by the back of his coat. He spun around, swinging wildly at his new attacker when— bang! Something slammed against the side of his face. In a brilliant flash of colour, 1,000,000 stars exploded inside his head. Gamely, Alex brought his fists up in front of his face, his head reeling. He was only barely able to make out the hazy forms dancing in front of him. A blur appeared to his right, and he recognized the dark form of Joel as he crashed into Herman, sending both boys into a thrashing pile of arms and legs on the snow-covered sidewalk. Somewhere in the distance he heard a shout, "Fight!" Gradually, Alex's head began to clear. He turned to face Lance. The other boy was climbing back to his feet, his breath coming in short gasps. Alex quickly sized up his adversary as if seeing him for the first time. Lance was slightly taller than him and a whole lot stockier. Icy blue eyes dominated a face contorted with rage. "You jerk!" Lance hissed, his eyes narrowed to tiny slits. "Now you're going to find out what I meant by no quarter." Alex braced himself. Lance Higginson's approach was slow and measured. When he got to within arm's length, he stopped, his breathing gradually slowing. "I'm going to fix it so you won't be riding in that race either. You'll be hobbling around on crutches, just like your little friend." He moved to within swinging distance, both fists now pulled up in front of his face. "If you fought as well as you talked," Alex said in a quiet voice, "the ambulance would already be carting me off to the hospital." He risked a quick peek at Joel and Herman, who were now on their feet and circling one another, with Joel having to throw his injured leg out awkwardly before him with each step. Several pedestrians left the sidewalk rather than pass the boys, even though they had to scramble over a snowbank and onto the street. "Trouble, boys?" The unexpected voice caused all 4 boys to freeze in their tracks, then slowly turn in its direction. "Jess Wheeler." Alex's mouth dropped open. "Looks like we have a bit of a misunderstanding here." "Bug off, mister," Lance snapped. "This is none of your business." Jess smiled and took a step closer to the boy, towering over him. Lance retreated. "This is private." He glanced over to Herman for support. Herman was watching the big miner nervously. "I'm sure it is," Jess agreed. "But these 2 fellas are friends of mine." "We don't need help," Alex said quickly. "Oh, that's probably quite true," Jess said, the smile never disappearing. "But if this little melee continues for much longer, somebody might get into trouble." "He's right," Alex thought, as he dropped his fists to his side, and the instant he did something crashed against his jaw. He staggered backward, fighting once again to stay on his feet. Only faintly was he aware of Lance lunging toward him, but there was nothing he could do. His head was spinning and his legs were jelly. Then, just as suddenly, Lance disappeared, and Jess was standing before him. "That's enough." Jess's voice had lost its friendliness. He stood, hands on hips, glaring at Lance and Herman. "Sucker punches are for cowards." "We'll see who the suckers are tomorrow," Lance said through clenched teeth. "Too bad I have to beat the city boy instead of his crippled friend, but even that's going to be sweet." He turned and stomped off down the sidewalk, Herman trailing behind. Alex stood for a moment, not daring to move, his senses gradually wobbling back into place. Joel came over to him and put a hand on his shoulder. "You okay? That was quite a punch he landed." Alex nodded. "I never saw it coming." Jess gripped him by the arm and steered him gently down the sidewalk. "My fault," he said, looking embarrassed. "I distracted you." "Actually, you probably saved us a lot of trouble," Alex acknowledged, managing a smile. "How about a coffee?" Jess asked. "There's a cafe just down the street." Joel glanced at his watch. "I guess we have time." He recovered his crutches from the snow and gave a disarming smile to 2 women who had been afraid to pass. "Sorry, ladies." Jess's hand remained on Alex's elbow, guiding him into the restaurant and over to a table by the door. There were no other customers. "I remember seeing you at Agnes's memorial service." Jess said to the boys after they had placed their orders. "Where are you from?" Joel asked Jess. "I don't remember seeing you around here before." "I am from Kirkland Lake, but I've been working at a gold mine down in Chile for the past year. I'm just back for the holidays." "It was nice you were able to be here for Agnes's funeral then," Alex said. "Yes, and I got to visit her one last time." They were quiet for a moment as they sipped their coffee. "Agnes was the genuine article," Jess said. "She taught me more about life than anyone I've ever met, and no doubt she'll continue to teach many of us through our memories of her." "Really?" Alex asked doubtfully. Jess looked across the table at him. About important things, anyway. "Like winning snowmobile races?" Joel laughed. "Mom thinks we're absolutely obsessed with winning and will probably be killed in the process." Jess's face broke into a broad smile. "I always loved competitions. I have half a mind to enter that race myself, but I know this young fella here would probably beat the tar out of me." Alex could feel himself blushing at the unexpected compliment, but he wasn't sure he should be so pleased. Mrs. Flynn was probably right. The thought of winning the Thunder Rally, even beating Lance Higginson, seemed to fade in importance. "Alex is getting to be quite the cocky driver, all right," Joel agreed, "but I wouldn't be talking him up anymore. It goes straight to his head." Alex glanced at his friend, unsure just how serious Joel was. Jess tilted back in his chair and eyed the two boys. "Agnes used to say that life's most important lesson was finding one's perspective." "Perspective?" Joel echoed. "That's right," Jess said. "But it's been my experience that discovering what's truly important in one's life can be downright elusive. Just when you think you have it, it's gone. A man needs to spend some time in a foreign land like Chile to help him find a proper perspective about some of the things we consider to be so important back here in North America." For some reason, Alex remembered Johnson and his little lectures on the importance of focusing, focus and perspective, more stuff to think about. Alex winced as he rubbed the spot on his jaw where Lance had landed the punch. Somehow the two concepts seemed to fit together. The importance of staying focused on the important things in life. But how did one determine what things were truly important? That's what he admired about Agnes. She seemed to have all of life's priorities sorted out, though he doubted if Agnes would have attached much importance to a snowmobile race. And how would she have felt about a street brawl? A niggling feeling of resentment crept through him. Agnes would no doubt be more concerned with preparing for the great hereafter. Well, that was fine for old people like Agnes. Jess? Well, he hadn't figured Jess out yet. Alex set down his cup and pushed back his chair. "We'd better get going, Joel. We're supposed to meet your dad at the grocery store. He's probably steamed by now." Joel took one last sip of coffee and struggled to his feet. "Now that's putting things in perspective," he said, reaching into his back pocket for his wallet. Jess held up his hand. "My treat, boys," he said in his easygoing way. "I'll see you at the race tomorrow." Another funeral. It was a gorgeous summer day. The Hawaiian sun sparkled and danced on the nearby waters of the Pacific Ocean. Alex stood beside Jess Wheeler under a spreading palm tree, looking down into the mouth of an open grave. An oak coffin was being lowered into the hole. Across from him, Alex could see his mother, weeping softly into a white handkerchief. Jess put a comforting hand on Alex's shoulder. "Too bad your dad never got to see you race." "Yeah." Alex watched as two men in rough work clothes began to shovel dirt into the grave, slowly covering his father's coffin. Something inside him desperately wanted to weep, to cry out for his father. He longed to jump down into the grave and wrap his arms around the coffin and bawl his eyes out. But it was too late. His dad was gone. Never would he have the chance to prove to him that he was actually good at something, really good at something. But what did it matter anyway? It probably wouldn't have changed the way his father felt about him. Alex was suddenly awake, staring up at the shadows on the ceiling above his darkened bedroom. Slowly, his surroundings drifted into focus, the desk and dresser across from him. And then he heard Joel's slow and measured breathing from the other side of the bedroom. It was all just a nasty dream. Perhaps winning the Thunder Rally would prove to his father that he was really good at something. For a moment he imagined himself on the victory podium, with the crowds cheering wildly and his dad clapping him on the back and shaking his hand, pumping it up and down with a huge grin on his face. Then, like a big soap bubble, the dream disappeared and his heart sank. It was no use. What made him think that his father would care about a stupid snowmobile race in the middle of nowhere? Then, in the darkness, Agnes's face drifted before him, her kind smile and gentle spirit. Like his own grandmother, Agnes wouldn't care if he won the race, if he ever won at anything. She liked him just the way he was. Then he remembered the one area he knew he came up short in Agnes's eyes. Agnes felt that he needed to make Jesus Christ a part of his life. He took a deep breath. That would certainly be a big step. It would mean making some changes in his life. But the thought of leaning on the same God that Agnes leaned on was strangely appealing and comforting. So much uncertainty, yet of one thing he was very sure. Whatever the results of the snowmobile race, whether he won or lost, or whether his dad was tickled pink, or if he couldn't care less, he had to give it his best shot. For once in his life, he would try his level best from start to finish. That would give him a fresh start, focus and persevere. After that, he would be able to square his shoulders, look his father straight in the eye and know his dad had been dead wrong about him. Chapter 15. Thunder Rally. Alex awoke just as the light began to creep beneath the blinds of the bedroom window. He crawled out from under the covers and pulled the window curtain aside. Good grief! Joel rolled over and peered up at his friend. What's the matter? It's snowing, Alex said in disbelief. That's not good. The big race is today. How am I going to race in a blizzard? Well, they're not going to cancel the Thunder Rally because of a little snow, Joel said, climbing gingerly out of bed. Alex took a deep breath. It's more than a little snow, he said. You can't even see the tree line from here. His hand went unconsciously to the lump on his jaw. That was some punch Lance had landed. Get yourself psyched, my friend. Joel's face broke into a broad grin. This is the day we show Lance who's boss. Alex could feel his heart beginning to race in anticipation of the day ahead as he dressed and made his way down to the kitchen. I didn't suppose you boys would be up so early, Mary Flynn greeted them. Joel's dad was already sitting at the end of the table, sipping his coffee. So today's the day, eh, boys? You be careful, Alex, Mary Flynn warned, bustling about the kitchen. I could never face your parents if you got hurt in this silly race. Alex gave her a sickly smile, thinking of the thick snow falling outside. The snowstorms made Alex a little nervous, Joel teased. It sure is blowing up a blizzard out there, Jack Flynn agreed. You'll have to slow down, especially on the bends. We'll be coming into town later to catch the race. In the meantime, I've got some correspondence to catch up on before I go anywhere. He pushed back from the table and made his way to the den. Joel waited until his mother left the room. Listen, Alex, he said. I'm sorry if I've been a bit of a jerk the last couple of days. My nose was out of joint over not being able to be in the race. He now had Alex's full attention. I guess our little tiff with Lance Higginson last night reminded me of who my friends are. I just want you to know that I'm in your corner 100%. You're a real good driver, and I think you've got an honest shot at winning today. Not just beating Lance, but winning. He reached over and poked Alex on the shoulder. "I wish you were racing," Alex stammered awkwardly. "And it's not just because of the storm either. It's your territory. I'm the city boy." Joel laughed. "We're both city boys, Alex. That's what's so perfect about this." Mary Flynn returned to the kitchen and put on her apron. "Looks like you boys don't have much of an appetite this morning." Alex got up from the table. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Flynn. If it's okay, I'm going to get an early start on the trail. I've got to get used to driving in this storm." He looked over at Joel. "You coming?" Suddenly, he just wanted the day to be over. The chill north wind and blowing snow reminded Alex of being lost out on the lake. As soon as he stepped outside, he knew that whatever slim chance he had of winning this race had been blown away with the swirl of snowflakes. "Don't let the weather get to you," Joel said as they strapped on their helmets. "No one in the race will be used to these conditions." Alex shrugged. "I still have some time to practice." Joel laughed and slapped his friend on the back. "Never say die. That's the spirit." "Let's go see Johnson," Alex suggested, suddenly anxious to see a supportive face. Joel gave his friend a puzzled look as he climbed into the passenger seat, propping his injured leg up on the running board. Driving in the blowing snow was even more difficult than Alex had anticipated. The blinding swirls and clouds seemed to come at him from every possible direction. He knew that his knowledge of the trail would be more important than ever, as his visibility was limited to only 40 or 50 feet. He was grateful, at least, that the trail groomer had passed. By the time they reached Collier's Bay, Alex was feeling a bit better. They'd no sooner pulled into Johnson's yard and cut the motor than their strange-looking friend appeared on his front steps. "What do you expect from our mysterious friend?" Joel asked as he and Alex climbed from the sled. "A pep talk?" In his typical wordless manner, Johnson stepped back inside the cabin as the boys approached, leaving the door slightly ajar. "All this snow kind of reminds me of the day you boys got lost in the blizzard," their host said, motioning them over to the kitchen table. He then crossed the room to the long wooden box, stretching the length of the far wall, reached in and pulled out a gleaming red helmet. With a moulded glass front and a silver vent protruding at mouth level, it looked something like an astronaut's helmet. "Wow," Joel said with a whistle. "First class." "A racing helmet," Alex said. "I was going to drop it off at your place this morning," Johnson said, handing it to Alex. "With all this snow, it may come in handy." Alex turned the helmet over several times, admiring each and every stunning facet. "Thanks, Mr. Johnson." "It's not to keep," Johnson added hastily. "It belongs to a friend. I'll need it back after the race." Joel laughed. "Appears you've got more friends than a person might think." "Not that any of them would admit to it," Johnson said, pouring each of them a cup of tea from a battered kettle. "We wanted to come by and thank you for everything, Mr. Johnson," Alex said, accepting the tin cup from his host. "I'll probably get a good tub thrashing, but I know if you hadn't helped me I would have been totally embarrassed." Johnson eased himself into a chair at the head of the table. "No reason you can't win. You just got to stay focused." "Yeah," Joel agreed. "Focus on how good it will feel to beat Lance Higginson." All the way from Johnson's cabin to the starting line, Alex's mind was in a state of turmoil. For days he'd wanted nothing better than to see Lance Higginson get beaten in the Thunder Rally, but now that it was his responsibility, the whole thing seemed overwhelming. He didn't want Joel depending on him this way, or Johnson, or most especially his dad. He brought the Polaris to a stop near the bright banner indicating the starting point of the race, and waited while Joel climbed from the back of the machine. A number of drivers were already milling about. A group of Joel's friends called out to him, and he gave them an exuberant wave in return. "Jess Wheeler will be along soon to give me a lift to the finish line," Joel said. "We'll meet you there." Alex nodded, peering intently into the driving snow. "Don't be so tense, man," Joel encouraged. "If you're all geared up, you won't stand a chance. I can almost smell the fear." Alex nodded nervously, barely conscious of his friend's encouragement. "Well," Joel said, "let's check in with the race marshal and find out when you start." A table had been set up under a large umbrella, and beneath it sat a harried-looking race marshal. 2 burly men in Ski-Doo suits were standing in front of him. "Do you think those guys by the table are in the race?" Alex asked, eyeing the stern features of the 2 men. Joel shrugged. "I hope so," he said quietly. "I've seen them both out on the trails. They're pushovers." The race marshal was a heavy-set man with a short grey beard and blue Toronto Maple Leafs hat. He glanced up at the boys when it finally came their turn. "Name?" "Alex Gray." The marshal ran his finger down the chart in front of him. 10:05, he said. "Make sure you're at the starting line a bit early." "Who else is in his heat?" Joel asked. "Walt Emberley, Cam Fenton, and Lance Higginson." Joel thought for a moment. "Emberley's greener than you are, and Fenton is older than Clarence and is probably just racing to get out of the house." Alex and Joel turned and made their way back to the snowmobile, eyeing the different racers and machines idling noisily in the clearing. "Looks like I'll have some tough competition," Alex said warily, looking about at the gathering sleds. "If I can't beat Lance, I hope they can." Joel waved his hand dismissively. "Are you kidding? Most of these guys are pussycats, Sunday drivers. Their greatest thrill is catching a little air when they hit a bump. You're the only one I'm worried about. After all your practicing, you'd better not choke on me." "I won't choke," Alex assured him. "I guess I'd better get into position. It looks like we're up after this group." "Good luck, buddy." Joel patted his friend on the top of Johnson's shiny racing helmet, then hobbled slowly away from the starting line. A dark cloud seemed to hover over Alex. He watched Lance Higginson ride his Arctic cat in amongst a group of snowmobiles across the clearing from him. Only vaguely was he aware when the first 4 racers roared out from the starting line. He started his sled, revved it a few times, and listened carefully to the sound of the motor. Across the clearing, through a covey of snowmobiles, he watched Lance wipe the snow from his visor, his sneering gaze sweeping the other racers. Why was Lance so obsessed with winning this race? And more importantly, why had it become so important for him to beat that obnoxious blowhard? He wished for an instant that he could catch Lance's eyes. Perhaps then he could see something there that would help understand the other boy, help to like him, just a little bit. For an instant he almost wished that Lance would win, anything to have this race over with and to be back home. The snowfall continued in an ever-swirling curtain of white, not as bad as earlier in the morning, but still heavy. Racing in this weather would test every little thing he had learned in the last few days. "You're up next," a voice announced close to his ear. 3 sleds rolled up to the starting line with Alex. One, a red Yamaha, was driven by a boy even younger than himself. The second, a yellow Ski-Doo, was driven by an older man in a black snowmobile suit. And the third, Lance's Arctic cat, rolled in beside Alex, so close that their skis almost touched. A race official, clutching a large green flag, climbed onto a chair to their left and raised the flag high above his head. Alex held the brake down hard with 2 fingers of his left hand. With his right hand, he eased the accelerator part way to the bar. The big motor screamed in protest, the brakes barely able to hold the snowmobile in place. Suddenly, in a whirl of colour and motion, the starter brought the flag flashing downward. All 4 snowmobiles leaped forward in a cacophony of noise and snow. Alex knew they would not all be able to run side by side beyond the first bend a few hundred yards away. It was absolutely critical to get out in front by then. He needn't have worried. Barely had the 4 machines burst out of the starting gate when the driver on the opposite side of Lance hit a small mound of snow. This threw his sled sharply to the left and into Lance. Lance veered to avoid a collision, but in so doing was forced to let up on the accelerator. Alex and the red Yamaha shot ahead of the other two sleds. "Keep to the inside." Johnson's voice echoed inside his head as he approached the sweeping bend around the beaver pond. He could sense that his machine was not only faster than the Yamaha, but he was also a better driver. By the time he had rounded the beaver pond, the Yamaha was already starting to fade. Alex waited until he had skirted the pond before he risked a quick glance into the rearview mirror. Lance's sleek Arctic Cat was only 4 lengths behind and charging hard. The other two sleds were barely visible through the swirling snow. "Focus!" Ahead now lay a number of sharp bends, winding through a stand of stunted cedar and spruce trees. "Focus!" He took another quick look in the mirror. Lance was still 4 sled lengths behind him. Alex swung the snowmobile onto the right-hand side of the track, punching the brake sharply as he entered the first bend, then, as he turned with it, hit the accelerator. He felt the back end of the sled swing out, catch and then shoot ahead. He veered to the left, catching the next bend in the same way. Suddenly Lance was in his mirror, close and visible through the blowing snow, right on his tail. Alex swung the machine back to the right and pushed the accelerator down to the bar. "I'm not going to make the same mistake I did with Johnson," he thought. "To beat me, Lance is going to have to be better than me. That's the only way." More bends, then a couple of straight-as-an-arrow runs through a stand of tall red pine. Johnson's new helmet was fantastic at helping him see the trail, but even so, the driving snow made visibility beyond more than 50 feet impossible. Alex knew that he'd have to stay particularly alert for snowmobiles on the course ahead of him. It seemed only a few minutes had passed before he was shooting by Joel's house and out onto Lake Kenogami. It was on the long stretch down the lake when he began to overtake the first of the sleds that had started ahead of him. Perseverance. Perhaps Agnes was right about its importance. Focusing his concentration on the snow-blown trail before him was critical. He knew Lance was still right behind him. He didn't have to look in the mirror or hear the roar of the Arctic Cat's motor. He was always there, matching him move for move, and never far behind. Keep him behind. He eased the sled over to the center of the course. When they swung into Collier's Bay, the tips of the Arctic Cat's skis were striking the back tread of Alex's sled. Lance's screams rose above the roar of the motor and the whistle of the wind, but every time he tried to pass, Alex moved an instant before his adversary, keeping him in second place. Alex launched his sled up the shoreline and past Johnson's cabin. He could see Johnson standing in the doorway, barely visible in the driving snow. He gave Alex no sign of recognition, no wave, nothing. Despite himself, Alex grinned. The 2 snowmobiles roared through the clearing and into the gap between the trees on the far side. There, the trail seemed dramatically narrower, but perhaps it was only because Alex had gotten used to the wide open spaces of the lake. The next couple of miles was marked by a series of small knolls or moguls. Alex knew that the trick to the moguls was to catch them just right, so that your treads didn't bog down when you landed. He loved this part of the course when it seemed he was always airborne. He could now really sense Lance's rising panic. It was evident in the way the other boy swung back and forth from side to side on the trail, trying desperately to pass. Still, Alex was able to maneuver a fraction of a second before Lance and block his route. A particularly large mogul rose suddenly out of the storm, and Alex hit it perfectly, rising to his feet and hanging onto the handlebars for dear life. The sled soared through the air like a kite, hanging for an eternity before crashing back to earth. A wild, exhilarating thrill rushed through him as the huge cloud of snow blew up around him like an exploding bomb. He had no sooner recovered from the jump than a gold-coloured sled suddenly appeared on the course ahead of them, dead center in the narrow path. Alex swung hard to the left, passing the other snowmobile so close to the trees that he was whipped by the branches of a large spruce. For a split second, his fingers eased up on the accelerator while he passed the other sled and regained the trail. He glanced to his right. Lance was right there beside him. Alex felt his heart sink. Lance must have squeezed by the snowmobile on the opposite side, and instead of slowing as Alex had done, accelerated, catching Alex napping for one fatal instant. He groaned. Lance's machine now protruded a few feet in front of him, and the finish line was almost in sight. Focus. For one brief second, he had forgotten Johnson's most important lesson, and because of it, he had lost the race. He knew there was no way to gain back those few precious feet, not in a straight-out sprint to the finish line with Lance's powerful machine. The sleek Arctic cat was now a good half-length ahead as they roared into the long final stretch. It was at that instant that he heard Agnes's voice inside his head. It was so clear that he could have sworn she was right there beside him. "Keep things in perspective, Alex. Even if you lose the race, the world won't come to a screeching halt." He edged the last bit of juice out of the Polaris, standing and leaning out over the windscreen, gaining back a couple of feet. Through the swirl of snow, a mere 100 yards ahead of them, he caught a glimpse of the finish line. A glimmer of hope rippled through him as he gained a few more precious inches. They were now dead even, neck and neck. Perhaps the race was not lost after all. He glanced over at Lance. The other boy was looking straight at him, his pale blue eyes blazing from under his visor. Never had Alex seen such a look of pure desperation, and he knew instinctively that Lance would stop at nothing to win. The eyes mesmerized Alex. He was sure that Lance was going to do something. Suddenly the Arctic cat veered toward him, shooting across the trail and slamming into the side of his machine. Alex managed to stay on his feet, bracing himself on the running boards as the two machines roared neck and neck toward the finish line. The Arctic cat swung back over to the opposite side of the trail, then in a heart-stopping second hurtled itself back toward the Polaris. Alex hit the brake so hard he was almost pitched over the windscreen in front of him. The Arctic cat shot past him, disappearing off the course and into the trees in a huge cloud of snow. Immediately, Alex punched the accelerator, his heart pounding wildly, his hands shaking. The finish line flashed by in a whirl of snow. He had beaten Lance Higginson. Epilogue. The evening sun dipped ever so slightly behind the western shores of Lake Kenogami, casting the wilderness in shadows. Clarence, Johnson and Jess Wheeler lounged comfortably in the Flynn's living room, looking out over the lake and darkening sky. An awkward silence had settled over the little group as they sipped the hot apple cider prepared by Mary Flynn. Alex felt the same sense of emptiness that had taken hold of him on the morning of the race. He had never really expected to beat Lance, let alone win the Thunder Rally, and now that he had, the feeling of elation somehow eluded him. Joel sat across from him, a huge smile on his face, and his leg propped on a small footstool. "I doubt if Lance will ever be the same," he said for the third time, laughing. "That was a real good piece of driving at the end," Jess Wheeler said. "Mr. Johnson taught you well." "From what I hear, you did stay focused, at least for the most part," Johnson admitted. "Too bad you're heading back to the city tomorrow. You still have a few things I'd like you to work on." Joel gave his friend an exaggerated wink. "Be careful, Alex. He'll have you racing in the Indianapolis 500 before you know it." Johnson glanced out the corner of his eye at Joel. "Maybe I could work on your friend here. He's got some potential from what I've seen." Joel laughed. "As soon as I get this brace off, I'll be coming by, Mr. Johnson." Johnson rose from his chair. "Time to go home." Alex extended his hand to his strange benefactor. "Thanks for everything." "I think I'd better get going, too," Jess Wheeler said, turning to Clarence. Do you want a ride home?" Clarence shook his head. "Thanks just the same, but I've got to drive my sled back. In the meantime, I'm just going to let my supper settle for a few more minutes and maybe have another piece of that cherry pie." Alex felt his spirits sink even lower as he walked his guests to the door, wondering if he would ever see them again. As soon as Johnson and Jess were gone, Jack Flynn shooed the two boys back into the living room. "You fellas can go and visit some more with Clarence," he suggested. "We'll finish up the supper dishes." Alex and Joel returned to the sofa across from Clarence. The old man was sunk into the plush cushions of the armchair, the picture of relaxation. "Thanks for letting me use your snowmobile, Clarence," Alex said. Clarence smiled. "That's quite all right, but I'm afraid you probably spoiled her." "It's been a great Christmas vacation," Alex said. "One I'll never forget." "Oh, this was nothing," Joel said. "You'll have to come back in July. You should see this place in the summer." He paused, giving his friend a puzzled look. "How come you've been so quiet since the race? Anyone looking at you would think you'd lost." Alex shrugged. "Sorry," he apologized. "This week's been really awesome, and I guess I'm just sorry to see it end. I have a whole jumble of confusing thoughts bouncing around in my head right now." "That's understandable," Joel said. "You went from a snowmobile novice to a racing champion in about a week." "Well," Alex said, embarrassed, "except for Lance, the competition wasn't all that fierce. You'd have really cleaned up out there." "Say, Joel," Clarence said, straightening, "would you mind making me a cup of tea? And while you're at it, how about rustling me up another piece of cherry pie? I think I may need a little pick-me-up before heading for home." "Sure." Joel pushed his way out of the armchair. "I'll be back in a minute." Alex studied Clarence nervously, bracing himself for some sort of lecture or pep talk. "I needed to talk to you alone before you left for home," Clarence finally said. His brow furrowed as he looked intently into Alex's eyes. "I guess you're trying to put everything from the last couple of weeks into perspective, aren't you?" Alex hesitated for only a moment, then nodded. "I can't stop thinking of Agnes, and what she said about keeping one's priorities straight. When I think of her, I can't help but feel this whole racing thing isn't all that important. I know I'm going to be facing challenges every day of my life, and I guess I'm just wondering if I'll even be able to figure out which ones are worth putting an effort into." "The race was important," Clarence corrected. "It taught you a great deal about perseverance, didn't it? You took all of the things that Johnson taught you and put them into practice perfectly. These 2 weeks were unforgettable for all of us. And you know, I think it may have been especially good for Lance to be humbled the way he was. He didn't only lose the race, but was disqualified for trying to run you off the course. It's important we take advantage of the lessons that life sends our way, and trials also have a way of putting things into focus." Keeping things in their proper perspective was what Agnes's values were all about, weren't they? Alex asked, a little afraid of intruding into Clarence's private world. "That's what she was all about," Clarence agreed. "For instance, in the final straight stretch when Lance tried to force you off the course, think of what would have happened if you'd hit a tree going as fast as you were." "It makes winning a race seem pretty unimportant," Alex agreed. "They might have had to ship me back home in that long box Johnson has in his cabin." "That's right," Clarence said with a chuckle. "I wish I could see things the way that Agnes did, though," Alex said. "I'd like to be sure of where I'd end up if I ever do run into a tree. Sometimes I think I do see, but it's like a shadow. I can't quite grasp it." "Nothing could be easier," Clarence said. "You just have to stop trusting in yourself and trust in someone else." "That would be Jesus," Alex said. "Is he, like feeling someone is right there beside you with a hand on your shoulder?" He had felt that feeling. "That's right. Remember when Johnson started coaching you? You didn't think you had a chance of winning the race, but gradually, one step at a time, he made it possible for you to succeed." Alex nodded. "That's a lesson on what it's like to trust Christ for eternity. You commit yourself to him and then take one small step of faith at a time, just like you did with Johnson. The stakes don't get any higher than this because we're trusting him with our eternal destiny. We need to tell him that we're sinners and we need him to be our Savior. So you see, it's very easy. But on the other hand, if you're not ready for that kind of commitment, it's so hard it's impossible. You'll know when you're ready, Alex. No more shadows." "I just want what Agnes had," Alex said simply. A smile creased Clarence's lined face. "Well, why don't you just bow your head, and I'll lead you in a short prayer." As Alex bowed his head, he heard a shuffling noise from the kitchen, and knew Joel was returning. Now he knew why Clarence had sent Joel away. A feeling of nervousness swept over him as he briefly considered postponing his decision, waiting until later when Joel wasn't around. But he set his mind and repeated Clarence's words, inviting Jesus into his life as his Savior. When he looked up, Joel and his parents were standing there. Mary Flynn smiled broadly. "I'm so glad you've made that decision," she said. "It's the most important one you'll ever make." She glanced at Joel hopefully, and then looked away before he could notice. Joel set Clarence's tea and cherry pie down on the end table and returned to the chair across from Alex with his own piece of pie. "Well," he said a bit flippantly, "I guess Agnes has her convert. Her work is finally done." Clarence looked at Joel in surprise. "Well, I wouldn't say her work is completely finished by any means," he said, his eyes narrowing. Joel sank back into his chair and grinned at Alex. "I suppose it will be just a matter of time before I get on the bandwagon too." Clarence's face grew serious. "You know they say that people react differently to God's love. It's kind of like the sun. The same sun will melt wax but harden clay. For some, the longer they put off a decision to accept God on his terms, the harder their hearts become. There may never be another tomorrow." Joel leaned forward and looked Clarence straight in the eyes. "Unlike my good friend here, I'm not quite ready to make that big a decision." The grin returned to his face. "But when I get a little older, Clarence, who knows, maybe I'll take the plunge. It doesn't sound like much fun for a young guy." "Well," Alex said, smiling across the room at his friend, "fun or not, I think what Agnes had will be perfect for me and for what I'll have to face when I get home. I know now that the hard things in life are not meant to be faced alone, and for the first time, I'll have some help." Outside, the blizzard had long since passed, and another cold winter night closed in on the northern forest. A frigid Arctic wind blew a light drift of snow across the freshly groomed snowmobile trail, and then silently disappeared into a grove of jack pine. Far out in the darkness, a lone timber wolf howled up at the rising moon, grateful for its strange, lonely life and for the wild, frozen wilderness that it called home.